If you remember a few weeks back, I had Kimberley Watson Smith on the podcast, and we had an epic conversation where she laid out the scriptures and proved that celestial plural marriage is a divine principle. On this episode of the podcast, I have Jacob Vidrine back on to talk about the history of plural marriage in the Restoration, Joseph's revelation on the subject, and plural marriage in the Utah period. Jacob's sources and presentation of that history are absolutely rock solid and put to shame the revisionist history that seems to be peddled today in some parts of Mormonism. And that's next on this episode of the Mormon Renegade Podcast. Because of your generosity last year, I was able to buy better audio equipment and software. I can't tell you how much it meant to me that not only did you spend your time here with me on the podcast, but also that you found enough value in what I'm doing that you donated the podcast to upgrade it. This year, I want to continue to grow. Now, I want to add video to the podcast to continue to help you, my guests, and myself connect better through the show. The other feature I'm working on for this podcast is something I have to remain vague about for now. But what I can say is that it's something that will help us better connect as fundamentalists and traditional LDS folks. Now, to get that equipment for the video content I want to do and to build the infrastructure for the other project with this podcast, donations would certainly be welcome. Or you can go to MormonRenegade.com, click that supply store button, and get some new swag. New stuff will be out soon as well. Now, if you can't afford to do either of those two things, I totally get it. Maybe just keep the podcast in your prayers that we'll be blessed with those resources. Again, thank you for everything you do as well as for listening to the podcast.
You're listening to the Mormon Renegade Podcast.
Well, Jacob, it's been a minute, man. How have you been?
Been good, Dave. How are you doing?
Good, man. How's life been treating you well?
Yep, just, excited for springtime. Hopefully will come soon instead of this back and forth, one day sunny, one day winter here in Utah. I know you've probably been dealing with that also.
Dude, I'll tell you what. If anybody wants an example of what bipolar looks like, they just need to look at our weather. Some days it's, you swear it's almost summer, and then the next day it dropped 18 inches of snow. So it's nuts. But, dude, I'm glad you're here. I mean, when we talked about doing this episode, I just find it so important today with all the pushback against plural marriage. And I feel like the more voices I get out there with people who can make a doctrinally based argument about it is just huge. So I appreciate you coming on.
Well, I'm glad to be on. And this is honestly, when it comes to the gospel, there are so many other topics that I personally think are way more important to talk about. But for example, when I first got into fundamentalism and Mormon history, one of my teachers who taught me Mormon history basically was handing me a bunch of material, and he kind of skipped over the plural marriage material, saying, if you're like me, that battle has already been fought and won. And I was like, yeah. And he's like, you'd probably be a lot more interested in priesthood. And I'm like, yep, that's true. But unfortunately, as we've seen the last several years, the battle over plural marriage has almost rebooted, where it's almost an exact repeat of what was going on in the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s. So that means the battle's back to the issue, and it's an important issue to have a conversation about.
I think you bring up a good point there that I think points to a larger principle. I don't think we can ever look at these principles and just assume that the battle's won, right? Mm-hmm. I think sometimes we get this feeling of complacency, like, well, the history is obvious, right? Or the doctrine is obvious. And as soon as we neglect that part of the fortification, so to speak, to go build up against something else, the adversary will try to get in on the other side.
That's so true. And for me, what I think is, why this is so important, not just for you and I who are fundamentalists and believe that people can be authorized by God to practice it today, but also for mainstream LDS members. This is an important issue because it is ultimately an attack on the entire temple doctrine that Joseph Smith restored as the pinnacle of the last several years of his life. If you attack plural marriage, you throw into question everything else about the temple, from the endowment to eternal marriage to baptism for the dead. And you can see that in a lot of this growing polygamy skeptic or polygamy denial movement, where it's just an all-out attack on the temple and those last doctrines that Joseph Smith established during the last several years of his life.
Yeah. And I want to get this. Well, you know what? I'm going to sit on it. And see how I feel towards the end. But
okay.
Why don't we go ahead and get started here then?
So do we want to start off by, for me, the big question for me, when I talk to a lot of people who I understand come from the polygamy skeptic camp, it comes down to, is it moral more rather than was it historical? They're framing their historical perspective based off of they really like Joseph Smith. They want to believe in Joseph Smith, but they can't accept Joseph Smith as a polygamist because of their moral problems. They find it morally questionable at best. And so for me, that's why it's always important to start off with the doctrine, even though both the doctrine and the history are important subjects I hope we can kind of talk about tonight. So
absolutely, yeah. I think that's a good place. Let's establish it doctrinally. That, I think, is the most important question. And then let's move on to historical, the historicity part of things, because I think that's it, almost as important as much as it is doctrinally.
So to start off with that, just a quote by Brigham Young on this. He said, because some people, the most common misconception is that it's about lust or it's about carnal desires. But Brigham Young is very explicit on this so many times, where he said, quote, God never introduced the patriarchal order of marriage with a view to please man and his carnal desires, nor to punish females for anything which they had done, but he introduced it for the express purpose of raising up to his name a royal priesthood, a peculiar people. Do we not see the benefits of it? Yes, we have lived long enough to realize its advantages. He said, suppose I had the privilege of only one wife, I should have only 3 sons, for those are all that my first wife bore. Whereas now I have buried 5 sons, and I have 13 living. It is obvious that I could not have been blessed with such a family if I had been restricted to one wife, but by the introduction of this law, I can be the instrument of preparing tabernacles for those spirits which come into this dispensation. And so really, it's not about lust. It's a matter of principle, not a matter of passion, is what the early brethren said over and over again. And they actually were against men who got into plural marriage because of this lust or passion. For example, Orson Hyde made a comment that I just love. That he says, I've heard it remarked sometimes by individuals who are not identified or connected with our church that if they could only be convinced polygamy was true, they would become Mormons at once. Well, I say, do you believe in the Bible? Certainly I do, says the inquirer. Did Father Abraham and the ancient patriarchs live in this relation and practice this doctrine? You say that they did. Then if they practice it, you are bound to be a Mormon upon your own hypothesis and reason. But gentlemen, if I knew this was the all-convincing argument that it was the principal doctrine alone influenced you to become a Mormon, I should at once say, never let me baptize such a person. Let me never be the agent to bring such a person into the church or kingdom of God. God despises every character who would enter this church for no other purpose than to criminally indulge his natural propensities. So they said it's about raising up a royal priesthood, and it's about really, some people say it's about quantity, but I think it's a priesthood rather than be born into broken families or other unideal situations. That's the idea of bringing those, giving spirits an opportunity to be born into families with the gospel is one of the big reasons for plural marriage. So when we get into the scriptures, that's what it comes down to when it comes down to the doctrinality of it. As they mentioned, it's clearly in the Bible. It's clearly what the patriarchs practice. The question is whether God approved it or not is the $1 million question. And the skeptics always point to Jacob chapter 2 to say that God doesn't approve of it. They think it's most correct book, Jacob chapter 2. But for me, in my personal quest for truth, does Jesus Christ ever, either in his mortal ministry in the New Testament and any of the Gospels, or in Third Nephi to the Nephites, giving them the fullness of his gospel, does Christ ever say a word against plural marriage? From your recollections?
Yeah, I think he says he does nothing save he saw his father do it.
But he never says that. So, for example, plural marriage is permitted in the Old Testament in Exodus, where he even says, that God permits, that you can take another wife as long as you do not neglect your first wife in, her necessities of life or her marital rights, right? Is what
Right.
Exodus 21 verse 10 says, if I'm remembering the verse right off the top of my head. But does Christ ever say that Moses got it wrong in permitting plural marriage?
No.
So I say, for me, when I look at the gospel, it needs to be centered on what Jesus Christ taught first and foremost. Other prophets are great. Jacob in the Book of Mormon is a true prophet. I think he's absolutely an inspired prophet, but my rock needs to be on Jesus Christ and what he taught. And the only thing he really warns people about is, he's like, divorce. And he says, Moses permitted it because of the hardness of your hearts. It's not an ideal thing. It's, God joined them together and let no man divide them asunder. That's something in every single gospel. And so I would think that if Christ had a problem with the Old Testament practice of plural marriage and said, I think he would have been explicit. And, that's something you find throughout the New Testament, is that while the Old Testament is very clearly permits it, where there's patriarchs, priests, prophets, kings who are polygamous, the New Testament never condemns them for doing that. And so the question becomes, well, how do we fit it with Jacob chapter 2? And the real question you'd be asking when you're looking at Jacob chapter 2 is, Jacob chapter 2 revealing a higher law or a lower law when you're looking at the condemnation of polygamy in Jacob chapter 2? And in my opinion, when you look at the context, who is he speaking to? Is he speaking to a bunch of righteous people? No, he's speaking to people and condemning them for their wickedness. And so I think it's much more clear from the context of Jacob chapter 2 that he's giving them a lower law. He's saying, you guys, because of your wickedness, are not to live plural marriage, is how I interpret that. And so for me personally, when people center their entire outlook on plural marriage from a Jacob chapter 2 perspective, it's almost what I would consider like an evangelical who bases their entire perspective on the gospel of Christ from one of Paul's epistles. They say, if you just read Paul, if you just read this epistle of Paul, that summarizes the gospel. In my opinion, you need to go with what Jesus Christ taught first and foremost.
Well, let's talk about Jacob 2 for just a second here, right?
Okay.
Because he also gives a caveat in that he says, you're not to do this unless the Lord commands, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so don't do it unless the Lord commands. I would say this, D&C 132 is very clear that it was restored, right? And to my knowledge, a manifesto that says to whom it may concern isn't a revelation, and it doesn't negate the commandment that was given. So even if you want to put all your eggs in one basket on Jacob 2, you have to understand Jacob does give a caveat in there where he says, unless the Lord commands it, don't do it. But when it comes to the Latter-day Saints, the command was definitely given.
Yeah, and when you look at it, really, plural marriage, more than any other principle of the gospel, we believe it needs to be directed by revelation from God, right? It doesn't just come from yourself. in your own desire, but that you need to be given revelation from God to live it. In fact, that actually reminds me of what W. Phelps recalled Joseph Smith told him. So there was a revelation in July of 1831 about intermarriage with the Lamanites, which was understood to be a revelation that plural marriage would eventually be restored. And W. Phelps has a copy of this revelation, and he sends it to he copies it and sends it to Brigham Young, but also with this comment afterwards. He says, quote, "About 3 years after this revelation was given, I asked Brother Joseph privately how we that were mentioned in this revelation could take wives of the natives, as we were all married men. He replied instantly, in the same manner that Abraham took Hagar and Keturah, and Jacob took Rachel, Bilhah, and Zippah by revelation. The saints of the Lord are always directed by revelation." And so you're right. There should be this cautiousness in regards to people going after it based off of their own desires and not having the Lord direct them. Because according to what Brigham Young said, and according to what Lyman White recalled, Joseph Smith told the apostles and warned them that, quote, the principle of plural marriage would, quote, damn more men than it would save. And Brigham Young said the abuse of it will send thousands to hell. And so just like you mentioned Jacob 2 verse 30, that caveat, for if I will command my people, otherwise they shall hearken unto these things. And I have sources showing that as early as 1844, that was being used as a pro-polygamy verse. Like, people try to say that was a later reinterpretation. No, it was used that way in Nauvoo as a pro-polygamy verse. But there's also verse 27, 3 verses earlier, where Jacob 2 verse 27, it interestingly says that no man among you shall have but one wife. So it's interesting that it's not in all times and places. Why would he include the among you to that verse if it was supposed to be an eternal period, that God never would be okay with plural marriage, right?
Right.
So, but you do have to go into Jacob chapter 3 as well. So Jacob 3 verse 5, I'm just turning to it real quick. So Jacob 3 verse 5 says, but there was a commandment to their father Lehi, which was given of the Lord, that they should have save it were one wife, and concubines they should have none. So they, through Father Lehi, were actually, the early Nephites were given a commandment not to practice plural marriage. Orson Pratt interestingly commented on this. He said, "This is the only place in scripture that I am aware of where any branch of the house of Israel was forbidden from the practice of plural marriage." And he goes, why was it? Because there was too small. He said they were all under the guidance of the Lord, and it would have been too small of a population for it to work. And so that brings to mind other statements about because some people say that why don't the scriptures tell us about Adam being a polygamist? Why don't they say Noah was a polygamist if this is essential higher law? And part of it could be say it was left out of the record for specific purposes. There's some arguments about Adam potentially having multiple wives on this earth.
I think Brigham was pretty clear that he did, if you read the Journal of Discourses, Volume 1, right, where he says Adam came to this earth with one of his wives, Eve.
Well, he said he definitely had them in heaven, but it's questionable whether he had them on earth. And basically what Brigham Young said as to the monogamy of Father Adam and Mother Eve, he said that they were just enough to get the population started. And he basically said part of the reason for plural marriage is because of a wicked world where men are inclined to wickedness, and thus depriving women of the opportunity to have a righteous husband. And so that's why I say in the beginning of the Nephites, they're given a special commandment not to live plural marriage, because they're equal in number and they're all under the guidance of the Lord at that time. But later on in the Book of Mormon, you can see that, say, Amulek was a polygamist. There's other examples of hinting at polygamy by different individuals in the Book of Mormon. So that would explain why, say, Adam or Noah weren't necessarily polygamists at the beginning of their generations is because there wasn't it was starting a clean slate, if that makes sense.
Right.
And so that's one argument if you don't want to believe in the arguments that they may have had other wives, but it's not explicitly laid out in the Old Testament. So
one of the arguments I've heard against plural marriage, especially from an evangelical point of view, is that, well, every time it happens in the Bible, it turns out to be not something that you would want, right? They point to Abraham and the problems that he had with Hagar and whatnot, or Solomon marrying wives outside of Israel. What would be your rebuttal to that?
Man, if you look at these stories in the Bible about men having more than one child, there's some pretty, good, compelling evidence that having more than one child isn't a good idea. Because if you look at Cain and Abel, he's murdering his brother. If you look at Esau and Jacob, there's this severe jealousy to the point where Esau's considering killing Jacob. So clearly the Bible is trying to include these terrible situations to tell us that having that having more than one child is a very bad idea. Is kind of that's how I would personally respond to it, because the reality is life is messy, history is messy, and I'm glad that God includes all of the messy stories in Genesis to let us know that people can be called of God even though they're in imperfect circumstances, in imperfect families. Is kind of my way of looking at that personally. What about you? Do you have any other?
Well, I think this has been my take on it for a while. You know how the news doesn't ever really give you, the day-to-day of the mundane, right? Here's my thing. We know that Jacob had, I think, 3 or 4 wives in the Old Testament, and we don't hear about any real issues there, right? We don't see too much struggle in terms of, his home life, if I remember correctly. And so I tend to think that the Lord uses those circumstances, like with Hagar and Abraham and Solomon, as kind of cautionary tales, right? This is what happens if a man's heart isn't in the right place or a woman's heart isn't in the right place. It leads to disaster. And so rather than focus just on the negative of the situation, you have to look at the breadth of Scripture and really understand that more than likely there were a lot of men who were practicing plural marriage that we never heard about, right? Mm-hmm. The other thing I would say is a lot of times people will use the absence of evidence as a way of justifying a position, right? They do it with Christ a lot. They'll say, well, why didn't Christ command it in the New Testament? Well, just because he didn't speak about it directly doesn't mean that it's outside the pale of orthodoxy. It just means we don't have record of it until the Restoration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you mentioned the story of Jacob and his wives. What's interesting is that's one of the places in Genesis. And Leah said in Genesis 30, verse 18, God gave me my hire because I have given my maiden to my husband, i.e., as a plural wife. And so Orsa Pratt made this compelling comment on this verse. Who ever heard of the Lord hearing one's prayer because a person was doing an evil? If polygamy were a crime, God would have condemned her because she gave up her handmaid to her husband. We can't suppose that any woman not acquainted with the law and commandment of the Most High and believing it to be sinful for her husband to have 2 wives would express herself in such a manner. The Lord heard my prayer and gave me the 5th son because I gave my handmaiden to my husband as a wife. This shows to us that Jacob's wife Leah did really consider it something pleasing in the sight of God. And so there's many other places in the verse in the New Testament. Like a lot of people try to say that D&C 132 and Jacob chapter 2 contradict in talking about David and Solomon. And I think that's a very superficial reading of that.
Right.
And in reality, when you look at First Kings 15:5, and both also the Joseph Smith translation of it, it is very explicit that David did not commit any major transgression in his life except for what he did in the matter of Uriah. So this is almost, D&C 132, I think, almost says this almost identically. It's not quite the same, but it's pretty similar. He said, because David did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord and turned not aside from anything that he commanded him all the days of his life, save only in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. And if you go back to 2 Samuel, he talks about the Lord gave you he gave you the kingdom. He gave you your master's wives into your bosom. And he said, if this would have been too much, I would have given you even more. In the King James, it's kind of obscured. It just says, I would have given you such and such things. But in the Hebrew, that's idiom, meaning I would have given you much more. And so other translations get that idiom better. And so, but people will say, well, where is it commanded anywhere in the scriptures? And I would say, if you look at, so the Old Testament obviously isn't going to contain the full details of God's dealings with the patriarchs and their, what they were told and were not to, told to do, and what they did under the Melchizedek priesthood, because this is a record that has been passed down through numerous generations, centuries of apostate Israel. And it was even abridged by Moses, arguably, to not, for the people in their apostate condition. So it obviously wasn't going to contain everything about the Melchizedek priesthood there. In fact, that's what the Joseph Smith translation says, is that the everlasting covenant and the holy order and its ordinances were not going to be included in the tablets that he was going to write for the children of Israel. And so with what, you have to take it, like you said, where it's not going to give you the full details. Unfortunately, we have a prophet with the Melchizedek priesthood who restored the knowledge of the holy order and its ordinances to us, and gave us the law of, the new and everlasting covenant of marriage in D&C 132. So,
Yeah. No, I think you're spot on. The other thing I think that we fail to and I say we, I mean me included, is that we look at the scriptures and we read them with our 21st century eyes. And we do not take into account custom, culture, or any of those other things, right? So what we may be looking for now as something that might be extraordinary or something of particular importance may not have been that out of the norm in ancient Israel, right? Where they're constantly breaking down, hey, and that dude had 2 wives, and that dude had 3 wives, and that dude was single, and that dude just had 1 wife, right? Because it was the norm in that time period for plural marriage, right? So we tend to look for those things because, again, we're in the 21st century and we're still dealing with Victorian era kind of principles, and we tend to look for those things. But to some of those ancient Israelites, it was just part and parcel of life.
Yeah, and so and on that comment of the problem of looking back with 21st century eyes, I totally understand people who struggle with some of the things that were said or taught in the early days of the Restoration, or stuff that's in the Bible. I just think back to this Brigham Young quote that I think that every saint should take to heart, where he said, "The saints who live their religion will be exalted, for they will never deny any revelation which the Lord has given or may give, though when there is a doctrine coming to them which they cannot comprehend fully, they may be found saying, the Lord sendeth this unto me, and I pray that he will save and preserve me from denying anything which proceedeth from him, and give me the patience to wait until I can understand it for myself." Such persons will never deny, but will allow those subjects to which they do not understand to remain until the visions of their minds become open. This is the course which I have invariably pursued, and if anything came to me that I could not understand, I would pray until I could comprehend it. Do not reject anything because it is new or strange, and do not sneer nor jeer at what comes from the Lord, for if we do, we endanger our salvation. And so the key part that I like is, give me the patience to wait until I can understand it for myself. So that need
Right.
of being patient with the Lord and not being hasty to pass judgment call on anything that, is said to have come from the Lord. So with plural marriage, I think D&C 132, if we jump into plural marriage as laid out in D&C 132, it clearly lays out that it is a higher law of the gospel. And it's not just so some apologists for the church will try to say it was just a temporary commandment, rather than being an eternal law. But I think it's very clear from many statements from the early brethren that it was considered to be a higher law. For example, a statement by Wilford Woodruff said, "We have many bishops and elders who have but one wife. They are abundantly qualified to enter the higher law and take more, but their wives will not let them. Any man who will permit a woman to lead him and bind him down is of but little account in the church and kingdom of God. The law of patriarchal marriage and plurality of wives is a revelation and commandment of God to us, and we should obey it." But says one, "If you do, Judge McKean will be after you." So this is in 1875, and they were facing the threat of being thrown into prison for it. They're just barely starting to. And he says, what has given us a future in these mountains, in the valleys of these mountains, is because we've obeyed this part of the celestial law of God. And on the comment about Judge McKean will be after you, Franklin D. Richards recalled that Brigham Young said that a man who wouldn't be willing to go to prison for a good wife isn't deserving of a wife, if he isn't willing to go to serve some time for that marriage. So, and another quote, this is another Wilford Woodruff quote, and there's a bunch of different leaders, but this is just a good one. He said, "When a man, according to the revelation, marries a wife under the holy order which God has revealed, and then marries another the same way, he enters into the new and everlasting covenant. And so far as he has gone, he has obeyed the law." So I think it was very clearly understood by the early brethren that this was an essential, that this was essentially a higher law to fully live the new and everlasting covenant of marriage. And do you have a thought?
Yeah, I just want to stop you right there, and I want to explore something real quick because I think it's super important to understand this. If we look at what the brethren are teaching early on in the LDS Church's history, the new and everlasting covenant of marriage was about plural marriage. This idea that no, that's just what we call sealing. That isn't necessarily the case, right? And I know that this may seem harsh to some people, and I apologize for that, but I gotta call a spade, and I gotta tell truth as I understand it from the history I've gleaned. And if you listen to those early brethren talk, especially in the Utah period when they're safely tucked away in the mountains for a while, it's clear that when you married a wife in the temple, even your first wife, and you entered into, quote, the new and everlasting covenant of marriage, you were also making a covenant to say, I'm open to this, meaning plural marriage. Right or wrong on that?
All the laws, rights, and pertaining to the new and everlasting covenant. That's part of the promise in the marriage ceremony. So absolutely. And on your subject, on that same subject, some Mormons today think that the term celestial marriage just is synonymous for eternal marriage. But in reality, it wasn't until the late 1880s that those two terms started, that celestial marriage started to be redefined. In Brigham Young's day, John Taylor Brigham Young, John Taylor, and I think even Wilford Woodruff always defined the celestial marriage as being plural, celestial plural marriage. It was synonymous for plural marriage. It wasn't just an eternal marriage. And so, like in the petition for amnesty by the First Presidency in 1891, basically trying to say, can the federal government basically give amnesty to all former polygamists, to not face any threat of of legal action against us if, we don't take any more wives. It says, we formerly taught our people that polygamy or celestial marriage, as commanded by God through Joseph Smith, was right, and it was necessary to a man's highest exaltation in the life to come. So polygamy or celestial marriage. So that, uses those terms interchangeably. So part of the reason I would say that this is considered to live the fullness of the law is part of what understanding what exaltation is, according to what Joseph Smith taught about exaltation. What would you say Joseph Smith said exaltation was, just off the top of your head?
Just off the top of my head, I know you're going to throw me a curveball here, but I would say it was to be as God is, to be able to have eternal increase, to be able to inherit all the rights and powers and principles upon which God operates.
To be as God is a very good answer. That's actually exactly what this quote says, but slightly different in your expounding on it. He says, to know God means you learn how to become gods. God is exalted by the addition of subjects to his family or kingdom. So exaltation is about having a family. It's about creating an eternal family kingdom. And so Benjamin F. Johnson recalled Joseph taught the first commandment was to multiply, and the prophet taught us that our dominion and power in the great future would be commensurated with the numbers of wives, children, and friends that we inherit here. And our mission to this earth was to organize a nucleus of heaven to take with us the increase of which there would be no end. So that's a quote I absolutely love. That it's the fullness. The gospel isn't just about yourself, but an exaltation is about yourself. It's a family affair. Is what it was taught by Joseph Smith. So we established that polygamy is necessary for that it is the higher law, right? I
Right.
think we've totally established that to live a fullness of the new and everlasting covenant of marriage. But does every person in this life have to live plural marriage in order to go to the celestial kingdom and to in order to go to the celestial kingdom or to be married in the celestial kingdom? I would say that a common misconception among many fundamentalists is they think that if you don't live plural marriage in this life, you are not going to go to the celestial kingdom or not be exalted in the celestial kingdom. But I don't think that's necessary. I don't think that's an accurate understanding of what the early brethren taught. So Brigham Young said that everyone who is faithful to all the principles that are revealed, even if they aren't married, even if they aren't plurally married, they will be able to inherit celestial glory. But the amount of glory you inherit is based on your obedience to the commandments and the family kingdom which you have sealed to you here on earth. So a number of quotes on this. This is something that I actually compiled quite a number of quotes. So Brigham Young said, men and women will be saved in the celestial kingdom without even being married at all. Others with only one wife, some again with many wives. Whoever continues faithful to the end will have all the exaltation they can possibly enjoy. Let every person so live as to enjoy the Holy Ghost and please God our Father. The Revelation, D&C 132, though the greatest ever given to man, more than that will yet be given when we are ready to receive it. And so a lot of people point to the quote, well, didn't Brigham Young say that the only men who will become gods, even the sons of God, are those who enter into polygamy? To that, I would say you need to read that quote in the entire context. In order to become a god, you will eventually have to enter into polygamy. But he's talking in the context, he's saying you have to accept the principle of plural marriage in order to go to the celestial kingdom. He says, I wish to say to you and to all the world that if you desire with all your hearts to obtain the blessings which Abraham obtained, you will be polygamous, at least in your faith, or you will come short of enjoying the salvation and glory which Abraham has obtained. And so for me, I'm just a polygamist in my faith. I'm not living that principle. I don't know if the Lord will call me to live that principle in this life or not. For me, that's what that's up to him, what he decides to call me to do or not. But what's important is that we accept all the revelations and all the principles that God has revealed. And so Brigham Young said, can a man obtain an exaltation without a wife or two? He said, you cannot put a gallon measure in a pint measure, but both can be filled full. If a man is faithful with one wife, he may grow to become a gallon measure. And there's a bunch of other quotes on this. Brigham Young said, can a man obtain as complete a salvation with one wife as with 10? No, he said, quote, a man can obtain as complete a salvation with one wife as with 10, but will it be as great or numerous? No. And another one, just to kind of hammer this in, show that I'm not cherry picking, but that I've actually, got a few sources. This is in the autobiography of John Hawley. He said, the year 1868, I had some business in Salt Lake, and while there was a question asked Brigham Young in a school of the prophets whether a man could obtain a celestial glory with but one wife. He answered he could, but not to the fullest extent of glory. The question pleased me, although I wished to progress in that glory to the fullest extent of light and intelligence. This question and answer eased my mind somewhat on the subject of multiplying wives, as I had previously understood Brigham Young's teachings before that no man could obtain celestial glory unless he had come to the law of multiplication. And so, similarly, Lyman White actually taught his followers the same thing, where John Hawley testified in the Temple Lot case. He said, in those that were sealed in spiritual marriage were said to be in polygamy, as well as those that were not. The understanding was that they would enjoy the same glory as the others, but the ones that had more than one wife would enjoy a greater portion of it. And then, so that was his testimony about what he was taught by Lyman White in Texas. And so, in my opinion, if Brigham Young is teaching one thing in Utah, and Lyman White's teaching the exact same thing in Texas, and Lyman White never followed Brigham Young, that is, in my opinion, pretty slam dunk evidence that came from Joseph Smith, that they both received the doctrine of plural marriage and the doctrine that it was for a higher degree of exaltation and a fullness of exaltation, rather than, being a requirement to enter into the celestial kingdom, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm going to kind of put this in layman's terms real quick to make sure that me and the listeners are all understanding here. Because we do hear that, you have to enter into it in this life or else you're kind of screwed, right? For lack of a better term. My argument to that, just as you have pointed out, is you have to be willing to enter into it, right? You have to have that servant's heart. You have to make your will the will of the Father, right? And that doesn't mean that you're going to live it here. That just means that you're open to it. You're open to everything that the Lord seeks to bless you with. And despite our best efforts, and this is the thing I love about Mormonism, is that we tend to be very pragmatic as we approach our doctrine, right? We still have, despite that pragmatism, we still have to rely on the Lord. We still have to have faith and understand that even if things don't pan out like we want to here, they can pan out the way we're promised on the other side. Is that a fair assessment of what you were trying to say right there?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not necessary. So it is the higher law. It is a fullness of the law, and it is necessary to be a God. But if you are not permitted by circumstance, that the Lord will not he will not punish anyone that just because of circumstance we're not able to live all of his commandments. Just like we were talking about the early Nephites. There's nothing, in my opinion, that would say that Nephi isn't going to be exalted, or Jacob, or any other early Nephites who happen to only be commanded to live monogamy. So
right. I want to go back to what you were saying about Lyman White teaching one thing in Texas and Brigham Young teaching the same thing in Utah, and they're not affiliated. Okay. If you read Brigham's account of when he first learns of plural marriage, the dude ain't a fan, right? He says he steps out after learning about it, and he sees a funeral procession, and he says he actually envies the corpse inside the coffin, right? He was struggling with this just like everyone else was up front.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he saw the trials that they would have to endure for this principle. Like, if a man is lustful, there are so many easier ways for a man to satisfy his lust than to live plural marriage. Plural marriage is just as much, it's definitely a blessing for those who can successfully live it right. but it's just, you would know this better than me, that it's just as much responsibility.
It's more, it's a family times two, right? And so what I would say is this, is that one, if you're living it correctly, there are no illicit stories to tell, right? I had a good friend when I was right after me and my first plural wife got together, and he's like, tell me some stories, what's that like? And I was like, come here, I'll tell you. It's just like being married once, only a second time. And then I just left it at that, right? I mean, no, absolutely. There's more responsibility. You now have to protect the heart of two women, right? And I've always said, if I never, it's just more responsibility, and you got to be willing to embrace that and then find the joy in that as well.
Mm-hmm. So, and so, like I said, when I'm explaining this, I am not saying that it isn't a doctrine for exaltation, because as John Taylor, it was made abundantly clear in the revelations he received, the 1882 revelation, the 1886 revelation. So right after receiving the 1882 revelation, what did John Taylor say? He said, if we do not keep the same law that our Heavenly Father has, we cannot go with him. The word of the Lord to us was that if we did not obey the law, we could not go where our Heavenly Father dwells. A man obeying a lower law is not qualified to preside over those who keep a higher law. And so, can you imagine? It doesn't logically make sense that a man who has not lived plural marriage will preside over men living plural marriage as a god, unless you're going to have to enlarge in your heart and accept that that is something that will eventually be required, just as D&C 132 lays out in your eternal progression, if not here, then in the next life. So
absolutely.
So to kind of get into, do we want to segue into polygamy now? We were talking about Lyman White, and that's almost a great place to start.
Yeah, let's get right into that.
So there's just so many sources that prove that Joseph Smith was the founder of Latter-day Saint polygamy. Lyman White had absolutely nothing to do with Brigham Young after August 1844. Lyman White, he was there for the August 8th, 1844 conference. He was there in Nauvoo at that time. He immediately packed his wagons, and he was heading off to Texas almost immediately that same month. He first has to go regroup with his colony up in Wisconsin, and then they go to Texas. He does not stick around long enough for Brigham Young to have any influence on him, yet he taught plural marriage. He practiced plural marriage, among his colony in Texas. And, there's just so many other sources when it comes to the evidence of Joseph Smith's polygamy. So just to start off with a quote that I think is important in looking at evidence as a historian. This is from D. Michael Quinn in Early Mormonism and the Magical Worldview, page 322. The historian's role is to avoid isolating pieces of evidence as if they exist in a vacuum. When tainted by polemics and apologetics, historians seek to understand how each fact that is possibly relevant may be connected in the past with other evidences, no matter how fragmentary. We never understand the past. We will never understand the past as a seamless whole, yet we should be willing to acknowledge even unfamiliar patterns that diverse evidences outline. So the big difference between a historian who argues that Joseph Smith taught and practiced polygamy and those who argue against it is the historian who argues for Joseph Smith's practice of polygamy. He's taking a holistic view of the evidence. He's taking the totality, the big picture of all the different evidence from all the different sources and putting it together to create a picture, while a person who is a polygamy skeptic or a polygamy denier will try to say, we'll try to use a breadcrumb trail of evidence. I'm going to point you to this specific thing, and I'm going to point you to this thing. And he's trying to lead you along to his conclusion, and he's going to leave out all of the evidence that does not support his conclusion. And honest historian is going to take the totality of the evidence, and he needs to account for the totality of the evidence. And And granted, that means history is a lot of work. I've been studying the history of Joseph Smith's plural marriage and all the evidence for it for 4 or 5 years now, since it first popped on my radar as a major issue that was starting to be debated. I wanted to know the evidence. And I feel like even I've only scratched the surface of all the evidence and understanding all the evidence. But I have put together quite a bit on this. And I even wrote a paper in 2020 to either 2020 or 2021 to kind of address it because it was becoming such a hot button subject. So history takes a lot of work, and it really reminds me of a quote by Murray Rothbard. I don't know if you're familiar with who
I'm
Murray
not.
Rothbard is, but he was an economist, brilliant economist in the libertarian school of thought. He's considered almost the father of the libertarian movement in America, and he was very big on economics and understanding economic theory. And he said, "It is no crime to be ignorant of economics, which is, after all, a specialized discipline and one that most people consider to be a dismal science. But it is totally irresponsible to have a loud and voracious opinion on economic subjects while remaining in a state of ignorance." I would take that quote and apply that to history, saying it's a no crime to be ignorant of history, which is, after all, a specialized discipline and one that most people don't spend too much time on, but it is irresponsible to have a very loud and voracious opinion on it when you haven't taken the time to study it out fully. So to be a good historian and studying Mormon history, you really need to be balanced in several different areas. You need to familiar yourself with what's been written on the subject, what books and articles are on that subject. You need to have some experience looking at some of the source material, like going back and digging into the sources for yourself rather than trusting someone else's interpretation of the sources. You need to also be interacting with other people who are students or scholars in that field and getting kind of their feedback on different ideas and different understandings, to be interacting with peers in that subject. And and fourth, you just really need to be studying quite a bit. It's not just a little bit. You need to be studying quite a bit if you're wanting to really be a historian in a field. And so what's interesting is I came up with this list, and then I saw some polygamy skeptics use the same list, and I was like, you're throwing out the list, but you're only agreeing with it in word, not in sincerity. Like, these people will pretend they want to, they're just searching for the truth. They'll pretend that they're taking the totality of sources and that they're interacting with other scholars, but really, in my experience, they generally do not want to do that, and they want to kind of create a little bubble of their historical perspective, if that makes sense.
It does. Now, I'm going to ask you here, can you give me an example of that?
For example, the Hemlock Knots project, in my opinion, is very much a breadcrumb trail on many different issues. If you might think that he's just trying to give an unbiased take, but it's a very much a breadcrumb trail of different things to lead you to their conclusion. And Denver Snuffer's Things Against Plural Marriage, one of his talks, he just wanted to speak on two sources. He wanted to speak on the Nancy Rigdon letter in 1842, the Happiness Letter, and he wanted to speak on a letter from Joseph Smith to the Relief Society. And he gives an hour-long talk just on these two sources and uses these two sources alone to argue against plural marriage being historically verifiable. He's like, if I can just tear down the credibility of two different documents, then that's he thinks he's won his case. But that isn't how you do history. You need to be taking into account all of the documents, all of the testimony. And for me, it's not just, some people will say there's a lot of later testimony and you should just stick with the contemporary stuff, what comes in Joseph Smith's lifetime. In my opinion, plural marriage, so this isn't just my opinion, this is a fact. Everyone admits that when plural marriage is introduced in Nauvoo, it's introduced in secret, right?
Mm-hmm.
It is not something introduced publicly. The reality is that if something is introduced in secret, what contemporary evidence should you expect there to be? Should you really expect there to be a mountain of contemporary evidence if something is introduced secret and they're concerned about people possibly exposing it and getting people in persecution or legal trouble over it? Of course not. They're going to be very guarded about that, and that's why there is a limitation on the contemporary sources. But the reality is there is still plural marriage was introduced to enough people in Nauvoo that it's very clear that it was something that was taught and practiced. And so for me, when it comes to interacting with scholars, so with peers and this stuff, I want to steel man. I want to hear the strongest arguments against my historical position. Like, I'm not going to pick a weak argument just to tear it down. I want to hear the strongest arguments that my opponents can make and respond to them. And I think that, say, when I see the work of people like Justin Griffin or Michelle Stone's 132 Problems podcast, they really do try to almost straw man their opponents rather than steel man and try to, engage the strongest possible arguments. I actually noticed, so Taylor Smith did 2 debates with Justin Griffin. Justin Griffin initially uploaded those on his YouTube channel. He didn't just unlist those debates sometime in the last year. He set them to private. He does not want people, he's not very happy about how those debates went down with somebody who studied it out and had strong evidence to argue against his Carthage conspiracy 2.0, basically. And so that, to me, in his latest movie, we'll have to probably do a whole other episode just to talk about Doctrine of Christ and Who Killed Joseph Smith Part 2. But his latest movie, he talks to a detective, and I'm like, oh, he's talking to a professional forensics detective. I want to see him hash out the hardest arguments against his theory with this detective. No, there's no interaction of him showing the strong arguments against his theory with this detective. He's rather trying to sell his theory to his detective. He's like, why don't you look? He's trying to prove his theory rather than have this detective challenge him. And so that, to me, is strong evidence that he's not really, they often say, I'm just seeking truth. I'm just the unbiased person. I'm not in the LDS church anymore, so I don't have any bias stopping me. But the reality is, if you're seeking truth, you're going to be looking at the hardest hitting arguments against your position and addressing those hardest hitting arguments, if that makes sense.
It does. I think this also speaks to something that I think is super important. And that is, when we do history, if we're honest in how we do this, and I have this exercise not only with the gospel, but with the founding fathers as well. If you start with a presupposition of what you think is right, and then all you do is try to go find facts to prove that, you're not really doing history, right? What you're doing is cherry picking sources that prove, or what you think proves your point, and ignoring everything else. When you study history, you have to come at this unbiased, just wanting to know. Now, history is messy because it's people, and it's people in a time where maybe the best documents weren't kept around. We didn't have Facebook that logged all that stuff for us over and over. So there are certain inferences that have to be made, but you still have to approach it in kind of a scientific mindset where you're like, okay, let's just find the truth. Whatever the truth is, the truth shouldn't have an agenda. The truth should just be the truth because it is.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. And so when it comes to history, the big problem I see is people think that if you can get a few pieces, you can collect a number of facts to support your narrative, that is how you do history. But I just, that, as I mentioned, you need to take a comprehensive and a holistic view of the sources. So one analogy that I really like when it comes to history is that history is like making a map. You need to figure out what are the important things to include in your map, but also what's just as important is what what is not being emphasized in your map. And part of the reason you have interaction, you need to have interaction with opposing views, is so you could have some pushback. So I'm not the biggest fan of peer review, because peer review in practice in a lot of academic disciplines is almost, like it's getting disconnected from the original sources, and it's almost truth by consensus. And that's not what peer review is intended. That you need to be able to replicate it, and other people need to be able to check your work and see if you're taking into account all the relevant facts. And so no one can actually even write a perfect history, because a perfect history is impossible. You can't document absolutely every little detail about a person's life. It would just be impossible to write such a history. And so you have to figure out what is relevant, and you need to address all of the relevant and important factors in creating that history. So, and another question that comes up is, but a lot of, and this is common from a right-wing perspective, isn't academia corrupt? Should we really put our faith and trust in academia? And I would say one thing that I really liked in an interview that was done by Curtis Yarvin on Tucker Carlson, where he said a lot of things that are probably over 99% of our heads. But one thing that stood out to me, a point he made that was really good, is the most corrupt academia is places that's in connection to government power, and where if you can emphasize your power and your importance to get more funding, there is a bad incentive there to induce to skew reality, to give yourself that more power, more funding, if you can make yourself inversely important. So for example, with climate change, whether you believe in it or not, we're in 2023 now. It's supposed to been the end of the world decades. For the last several decades, we were told that we would reach a turning point where there's no returning. And but that fear mongering only makes sense in the attempt of them trying to boost their own power, get more funding, their own importance. And so when you look at fields, you need to look at, is there a bad incentive there for them to to exaggerate the importance of their work? And so there isn't, say, a woke math, because mathematics isn't a place where it's in connection to government power, by having higher math. So in Mormon history, the question is, does the LDS Church have this institutional power and control over the narrative of LDS history? And I would say that's definitely not true when you look at everything that is published, both by people in the church as well as people out of the church. There have been times where the church has attempted to use influence to to shut up different scholarly voices, but the most they can do to someone, that there's not, if a scholar wants to write on a subject and piss off the church, they can do it. And the reality is that all of this history that's been come out in the last 100 years of Mormon history is, the church is under the control of the government, not the government is in control of the church. And so the church really, as an institution, doesn't have the kind of power that some people might imagine it to be. It unfortunately does have too much influence over its members, to the detriment of members, in my opinion. But it doesn't really control the academic narrative. And there's a wide consensus from scholars of all different perspectives, from LDS historians to the reorganized church historians, to non-believers, to to former members, to agnostic, people who don't have a leg in the fight either way. There's a wide consensus regarding Joseph Smith's polygamy, and you shouldn't trust that consensus just because it's there, but that should make you cautious of just absolutely throwing out what has been written by historians on the subject of Joseph Smith's plural marriage, if that makes sense.
Yep, it does.
So to get into some other sources, some contemporary sources of plural marriage, one source that I think is fascinating is a letter by the late Kimball, Heber C. Kimball's wife, to her husband, Heber C. Kimball, in June of 1843. And this letter is really great for a number of reasons, where she mentions that Harley P. Pratt and his wife, Marianne Pratt, were being taught plural marriage by Joseph. And she originally writes Joseph, but then she tries to erase Joseph. Like, she wanted to just put J. Jay had even appointed one for that. He's been appointed one. And she's afraid they're going to run too fast in plural marriage, because he says he was interrupted before he got the instruction he needed. And they aren't being explicit about saying plural marriage in the letter, but the context of it, this is clearly they received private instruction regarding plural marriage. And so then she, near the end of the letter, she mentions the case of Joseph B. Noble's first plural wife, Sarah Ali, and her pregnancy. He said, "I have a secret to tell you, but I'm almost afraid. It was committed to Sarah, and she requested not to tell me. She was requested not to tell me, but she said she considered me a part of herself, and she would tell me, and I might tell you, for it was just as you had prophesied would come to pass. Now, if you know what you said about Sarah Lee, then you have got the secret, for it is even so, and she is tickled about it. And they all appear in better spirits than they did before. How they will carry it out is more than I know, but I hope they have got more faith than I have. Brother Noble's folks all send love to you." So it's very cryptic the way she writes it, but it's clear there's something secretive, and it's clearly alluding to the first plural marriage pregnancy in Nauvoo. And so that's one source that I would use to debunk the claim that that there's no evidence of this being consummated or plural marriage in this life, in the lifetime of Joseph Smith, because this was written June 29th, 1843, and it was about contemporary events in Nauvoo, and it mentions Joseph had just been that he had just been taken captive. People were trying to extradite him to Missouri, and so they were very concerned about all of the different things that were going on at that time. And she's writing details about plural marriage at that time. So another source that that would be a very compelling contemporary source, in my opinion, is there's just dozens. I actually made a list, and you think you've got a list of all the sources, and then you find out there's more. Like, I was recently made aware of a letter by Jedediah M. Grant to Joseph Smith in 1843, where he alludes to there was a plural marriage proposal. He's very cryptic, he's very alluding to it, but that Joseph had made a proposal, and it created quite a stir from those who were aware of this letter. And he said that he was able to get his hands on it, and that he says, "If you know that I'm a faithful brother, I put the letter to the fire to avoid any more further controversy regarding this." And so he's very cryptic, but he's referencing these things. If you go and you look at the William Clayton diaries, William Clayton references this letter where he writes about how Joseph got a letter from Jedediah M. Grant, and Emma is furious. There's several different instances where there's just allusions to plural marriage activity in Clayton's journals that you wouldn't know it was, what he's talking about if you didn't have the other sources. Unfortunately, that letter from Jedediah M. Grant has survived, but with other sources, like, say, so Joseph Smith's letter to the Whitneys in August of 1842, just after Joseph takes Sarah Ann Whitney as a plural wife, the letter Joseph writes to them, where he says he has very strong feelings for them after what's transpired recently, and he says he wants the Whitneys to all come, the three of them, and he wants to seal the fullness of his blessings upon their heads. So he's referencing some private ordinance work he wants to do, but he says, "But don't come when Emma comes, because otherwise you won't be, there won't be safety. But if you can come when Emma's not here, there will be we can attend to the matter in perfect safety." And so he basically tells them to, burn this letter after you read it. But fortunately, they kept the letter, and that is a letter, one of the few documents we have in Joseph Smith's own handwriting. And it doesn't have any explicit reference to plural marriage there, but he's referencing that something important had recently transpired between him and the Whitney family. And that was referencing the marriage of their daughter, which happened on July 27th, 1842. And the revelation documenting that marriage has been passed down the Whitney family and was preserved in the archives, and included in with a journal entries afterwards, where Joseph actually seals. He performs rebaptisms for Newell and Elizabeth Whitney, and then performs a marriage sealing for them shortly after that August 1842 letter. So there's just so many sources. The William Clayton diaries in and of themselves, a recent critique I heard, because like I said, I'm always looking for the strongest arguments. They said, well, wasn't Joseph telling his scribes to, so Joseph is telling them to keep it secret, and he's publicly saying that his records of journals would prove him innocent of plural marriage, that prove all these men perjurers who are accusing him of spiritual wifeism and adultery. So how does William Clayton's journal fit with that? Is he conspiring against Joseph? And the reality is, when you look at William Clayton's journal, it's so much of it is written in code, like E came to, he's using abbreviations, he's using single letters. He's like at 10 a.m. MJ to SL. You wouldn't know what that stands for if it wasn't for William Clayton later on saying that was marrying Joseph to Sarah Lawrence, is what he says. It's not even half a page entry, and he's being very, very cryptic in what he's writing to avoid, if his journals happen to fall into unfaithful hands, that could be, into the hands of an enemy. And so to answer the reply, why did Joseph Smith on May 26, 1844 say he kept scribes that would prove him innocent of all these allegations that were being made against him? So he's talking about his own journal, which is kept by Willard Richards, and that's the journal that the polygamy deniers do use to say, we have several statements in this journal of Joseph declaring, here he says he's walking up and down with a scribe against the teaching or preaching of the plurality of wives, and that Joseph forbids it. Entries like that. And because Joseph was keeping a detailed account of where he was, it would be a good way to, if somebody were to try to say, I know Joseph was with X, person. He can give himself an alibi, for example, based off of different journal entries saying where he was at. And so his journal was intended to protect him from, people who attempt to betray him, especially after the John C. Bennett scandal. He was wanting to be very careful about the introduction of plural marriage. But the thing that really sells the evidence of Joseph Smith's plural marriage, besides, we have the testimony of the apostles, the tried and trusted apostles who went on their missions to England and came back and were taught about the temple ordinances and temple doctrines from Joseph Smith. We have the testimony of the plural wives. We have the testimony of relatives of different plural wives, like the brothers or sisters or parents of different plural wives giving their testimonies of these marriages. We have the contemporary documents that exist. But beyond that, the thing that's most compelling to me is that you have RLDS sources, people who didn't follow Brigham Young, who give their testimony proving, basically admitting that even though I didn't accept plural marriage, I know that Joseph Smith introduced it. That to me, if you don't have a good explanation for those sources, you really aren't creating a whole, a complete history. If you can't explain why men like William Marks, James Whitehead privately admits to Joseph Smith introducing polygamy. So that's interesting. In his public temple lot case in the 1893 or 1892, James Whitehead swears up and down that Joseph Smith never taught polygamy, which would be a compelling witness. He says, I was a scribe in Nauvoo. I never heard of any woman being Joseph's wife except Emma. She was the only one I saw him acknowledge as a wife. But privately, we have him testifying to 3 different RLDS leaders in private that he knew that Joseph Smith taught plural marriage. He told Alexander Smith, Joseph Smith's son, he told W. Blair, who's another RLDS leader, he said, I know that he taught and practiced it, and that Emma put wives' hands into Joseph's hands. And he told Joseph Smith III, who, Joseph III was the famous in his anti-polygamy campaigning. He told him that I saw the original revelation written in William Clayton's handwriting, which and Joseph III's writing in his journal, which mother burned. So
Wow.
that's that's a pretty slam dunk piece of evidence, in my opinion.
Yeah,
So when you look,
whenever you can get two rival sources, so to speak, right here, because let's face it, there wasn't a lot of hugging it out between, Brigham's crew and the RLDS, right? So when those two can agree that happened, that carries a ton of weight, right? That carries the kind of weight that's really hard to disprove.
yeah, and the thing is, if I had sources in the Brighamite church, say if I had some of the apostles under Brigham Young admitting privately, hey, we say Joseph taught it, but I don't actually remember ever seeing him teach it. If those kinds of sources existed in the Brighamite church where you had private acknowledgments, of the other side being correct, that would carry a ton of weight with me and with any other unbiased historian, that that, okay, maybe we shouldn't trust Brigham Young if they're saying one thing publicly and a different thing in private. But the reality is, the private minutes, the private journals in Brighamite Utah are very consistent with what is said publicly. Brigham Young kept tons of minutes. They were the record keepers. That's the funny thing is, a lot of people will try to critique sources saying you're using, all these accounts of Joseph Smith's sermons are coming from Brigham Young followers. All the people who were keeping Joseph Smith's sermons in Nauvoo that I am aware of ended up following Brigham Young. Like,
Right. Again, it's one of those things where, absence of, evidence on the other side doesn't necessarily equate to truth, especially if Brigham got 100% of the people who kept those journals went with Brigham.
Yeah. So there's just tons of records that we have to thank Brigham Young and Wilford Woodruff and George A. Smith and all these early brethren who kept all the records that they did regarding early church history and regarding the Nauvoo stuff. That when we look at the history of the church, there isn't a whole lot of good records in the early history of the church. And Joseph actually, in a time or two, complains or says that it was negligent on them to not keep as good records. In the Nauvoo period, the apostles are keeping all kinds of great records. They're trying to keep journals. They're trying to keep records of Joseph Smith's sermons. They were sitting at the feet of the prophet, wanting to learn the deep mysteries of the kingdom as he taught them. And as Brigham Young actually said, I want to not only know what Joseph was teaching, but I want to listen to him and learn what he's not teaching the public. What can I learn from the Spirit is he withholding because the people are not yet able to receive it? And that's going to get into another subject of that there were certain doctrines that were actually revealed, that church members testified they got the Spirit teaching them principles in England before Joseph taught them in the when they got back to the United States. And that's something that's used. That's one of the strong arguments by the polygamy skeptics or polygamy deniers, but it's actually not very strong when you look at it in the total context. So just to talk about two of the other strong witnesses for RLDS witnesses that Joseph Smith introduced plural marriage. We're going to talk about William Marks first, and then Ebenezer Robinson. William Marks said, and this is in 1853. A lot of people try to say, you're quoting him in the 1860s, those are decades later. 1853 is less than 10 years after Joseph Smith's death. And he's saying this because plural marriage has been announced in Utah, and so he's having to respond to publicly. So he's kind of admitting and responding to it as a proto RLDS individual. He had just been a part of Strang's church for a bit, and he's part of a different sect for a bit, but he's going to end up in the RLDS church. But he wrote this: during my administration in the church, I saw and heard of many things that were practiced and taught that I did not believe to be of God, but I continued to do and teach such principles as were plainly revealed as the law of the church, for I thought that pure and holy principles only would have a tendency to benefit mankind. Therefore, when the doctrine of polygamy was introduced into the church as a principle of exaltation, I took a decided stand against it, which stand rendered me quite unpopular with many of the leading ones in the church. I was also witness of the introduction secretly of a kingly form of government in which Joseph suffered himself to be ordained a king to reign over the house of Israel forever, which I could not conceive to be in accordance with the laws of the church. But I did not oppose this move, thinking it none of my business. So there you go. He's mentioning both the temple ordinances of being anointed a king and a priest right there. And he says, I wasn't too fond of those things. I also wasn't fond of the doctrine of polygamy, which was introduced as a principle of exaltation. So, and he wasn't in the church under Brigham Young very long. He was out by October or November of 1844. So, are you going to say that Brigham Young introduced it? No, he was very clear in other letters he wrote that he knew that Joseph Smith introduced, plural marriage, and in his opinion, he tries to frame it in a narrative saying, I think that Joseph, shortly before his death, repented of it. And he came to me and told me, we got to put this down and we got to put people on trial for it. And, this is the story he alleges. Brigham Young wasn't in Nauvoo when Joseph died. And so Brigham Young just has to frankly, in his comments in response to that, he says, some people say that Joseph denied polygamy before he died. I don't know, but I don't believe he ever did. He says, but I do know he was worn out with it, is what Brigham Young said. But in contrast, John Taylor was there with Joseph at the time of his death. And John Henry Smith wrote a letter to Joseph Smith III saying, those who were with Joseph at the time of his death said they never knew of him to deny the principle. And they knew that he said he was willing to die for that revelation just as much as any other revelation. And so what William Marks, I don't want to paint him as a liar, but it is true that Joseph was making public denials, and it is possible that he tried to paint a public denial of, we aren't doing this, we aren't doing this polygamy, that he tried to frame that as Joseph repented of it is kind of how I would interpret, that statement. But the reality is, there's no solid evidence to argue that he turned, what kind of prophet, he introduced a doctrine, he allegedly repents of it, but then there's no record supporting William Marks in this regard. And why would you put people on trial if you were the one who introduced it, right? That doesn't make sense. The reality is one of the things that polygamy deniers will try to say is that Joseph was very voracious and active in putting polygamists on trial and really punishing them in the Nauvoo High Council. The reality is he really punished the John C. Bennett, those who were involved with John C. Bennett's whoredoms. Those people were punished because that wasn't plural marriage. That was whoredoms under the, trying to, basically just sleeping around under the same term, spiritual wifery. They were abusing, what John Taylor said is that John C. Bennett learned a little bit about plural marriage, and he abused the principles that he learned about for his own lustful conduct, and he's going to be damned for it.
I had Kimberley Smith on here not more than about 3 weeks ago. It's when I released her episode. And in the one sermon where people really like to hang their hat that, Joseph was really against polygamy and plural marriage and blah, blah, blah. They go back to one statement out of one sermon, and in there he uses the term spiritual wifery rather than plural marriage, because in that time, what John C. Bennett was doing was sleeping around and calling it spiritual wifery. So we have to understand that during that time period, those two terms, plural marriage and spiritual wifery are not interchangeable. Those are two separate acts.
So I agree with you in point, but I'm going to push back a little bit on that point.
Okay.
Part of my point, I agree that the May 26, 1844 sermon, that Joseph is saying he's being accused of adultery. He's saying this holy prophet is saying that I admitted to him that I'm guilty of adultery. Joseph, this is a big thing that comes up with Oliver Cowdery, where, Oliver Cowdery is saying that Joseph had, was accusing him of adultery. And Joseph's big thing is saying, I was not guilty of adultery, and I never admitted that I was guilty of adultery. Joseph was doing what God commanded him. There's a big difference between authorized plural marriage and adultery. So I absolutely agree that that is what Joseph is fighting back against. Is William Law's trying to say he's an adulterer, and Joseph's like, no, I'm not an adulterer. Spiritual wifery, in my opinion, John Taylor made a statement saying we called it in the beginning spiritual wifery. But what I think happened is because John C. Bennett used the same term to describe what he was doing, they had to move away from that. And that's when I think they dropped that term mostly, and they started just saying celestial marriage.
I see. Okay.
So, yeah, there's a cool source. Lyman White's son is a third-hand witness. He actually became a polygamist like his dad in Texas. And then later on, he actually joined the Utah church. But he basically gives a third-hand witness that he was a young man in Nauvoo, and he was going to, I think, Flora Woodworth. He was saying that he was taking interest in this girl. He just got home from a mission. He was taking interest, and he found out from her mother that she had been sealed as a wife to Joseph Smith. And so then, he was kind of told, that you're not to take interest in her. But he basically said the girls that were Joseph's wives called each other spirituals. So that's another kind of witness besides John Taylor that the authorized wives at time were called.
They move away from the term because it got corrupted by John C. Bennett.
Yep, absolutely. That's how I definitely see it. So the big thing, in my opinion, comes down to the legitimacy of D&C 132. That is the big kicker of whether or not Joseph Smith introduced plural marriage. And for me, to argue against it is to argue against a mountain of evidence as tall as Mount Everest, in my opinion, because you're just trusting Brigham Young, William Clayton, Joseph Kingsbury. So William Clayton made the original copy, he said, and Joseph Kingsbury made the copy of it for Newell K. Whitney, which was preserved because Emma burned the original, right?
Mm-hmm.
You also have William Marks, who didn't accept plural marriage, admit that, yes, I know that Hiram read the revelation to the High Council on polygamy. You have Leonard Sobey, who didn't follow Brigham Young, say, yes, I know that revelation was, that's in the Doctrine and Covenants of the said church now. That is, as far as I remember, the exact same revelation that Hiram read to us. And Leonard Sobey, he didn't follow Brigham Young, he followed Sidney Rigdon. And so he's another different third-hand witness to D&C 132. You have Austin Cowles in the expositor gives a very detailed statement, as does William Law and Jane Law, and those are all affidavits they made in May of 1844, which are in Joseph Smith's lifetime, that describe D&C 132. And then not only that, you have 5 different High Council members who came to Utah. Members of the Nauvoo High Council say, yes, we were in the High Council, and Hiram did read the revelation, which was given on July 12th, 1843 to us in the High Council. And we accepted it, but there were 3 men who didn't accept it. They were William Marks, Austin Cowles, and Leonard Sobey. And so the fact that you not only have the 5 living Utah witnesses testifying of it, and 5 living High Council members, plus other Utah witnesses, plus the all 3 who didn't follow Brigham Young, it's absolutely overwhelming that this revelation came to Joseph. And they always tie it to the Hiram, is what they say. Hiram is the one who really, I think that personally, what caused polygamy to almost get out of the bag, so to speak, in Nauvoo, where it was almost an open secret, was after Hiram was converted. He basically thought, if I can get converted, I think anyone on earth can get converted. So Hiram reads it to the Nauvoo High Council. He reads it to the elders quorum. He's giving it, he's reading it, he's teaching it to everyone he can, to try to, and that's Hiram.
Yeah, I was going to say, when you read the accounts, you get the feeling Hiram was on fire, right? Hiram was definitely out there saying, God has spoken yet again. Look at this. And he really went for preaching that doctrine.
Yeah, he went the exact 180 from where he was before, because he was so against it that Levi Richards records in his sermon, a May 1843 sermon that Hiram gave, where he said, if an angel were to appear to you and try to teach you this principle, you'd be sure to see his blackened tail and his cloven foot. Basically, you'd know it was actually an angel of darkness. God would never do this, is what he said. But then Brigham Young gives the account of Hiram's conversion only a week or two later, and William Clayton records in his diary about Hiram is laying a trap for the brethren of the secret priesthood, those who'd been initiated to plural marriage. He's given a heads up, I think, on May 23rd, 1843, by Heber C. Kimball. But then 3 or 4 days later, May 27th, he records President Joseph in meeting with the 12, meeting with Judge Adams and certain other brethren. Hiram accepted the doctrine of the priesthood. So there's this big period that Joseph, between 1842 and 1843, really does not have the anointed quorum, where so Joseph in 1842 begins to introduce the endowment ordinance, but he doesn't introduce plural marriage alongside it at the same time. It's kind of, plural marriage is being taught privately and in individual settings. The endowment, he first gives it to 3 apostles: Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, and Willard Richards, both bishops, Newell K. Whitney and George Miller, William Marks, William Law, and James Adams, and Hiram Smith. So you have kind of 9 men who are endowed on May 4th, May 4th and 5th, 1842, when Joseph is first revealing the endowment ceremony. And Brigham Young says that Joseph was absolutely depressed trying to do quorum meetings with those guys. And he said Joseph absolutely did not want to go with. He said Hiram Smith, would be saying things against it, and he said William Law would say, William Law said in one of those councils that if an angel of the Lord appeared to him and said that, tried to teach him polygamy, he would try to kill him. So Joseph was absolutely depressed, because he's trying to introduce these people to the doctrines pertaining to the fullness of the priesthood, and William Marks doesn't accept it. William Law and Hiram are kind of being in strong opposition. But when Hiram accepts it in 1843, Joseph actually goes and reconvenes the quorum, and he re-endows everyone. He gives them their endowments again, just to kind of celebrate that Hiram accepted this doctrine. And then for those who accepted the doctrine of plural marriage, Joseph then administered the eternal marriage sealings to their first wives. And so Hiram Smith was sealed to both his living wife and his deceased wife. Brigham Young, all these men, sealings had been introduced privately for plural marriages, but this is when you're finally getting like monogamous marriages being sealed at this time, right after Hiram accepts plural marriage. And what's fascinating is Hiram Smith himself gives an account of he actually announces the doctrine of eternal marriage at the April 1844 General Conference. He's like, I'm going to talk about plural marriage at this conference. Not plural marriage, eternal marriage, but at the same time, he announces eternal polygamy. And he says that Joseph sealed him to both his living wife and his deceased wife. He said, quote, I married me a wife, and I am the only man that has any right to her. We had 5 children. The covenant was made for our lives. She fell into the grave before God showed us his order. God has shown me that the covenant is dead and had no more force. Neither could I have her in the resurrection, but we should be as angels. It troubled me. Brother Joseph said, you can have her sealed to you upon the same principle you can be baptized for the dead. I inquired, what can I do for my second wife? He replied, you can also make a covenant with her for eternity and have her sealed to you by the authority of the priesthood. I named the subject to my present wife, and she said, I will act as proxy for your wife that is dead, and I will be sealed to you for eternity myself, for I never had any other husband. I love you and do not want to be separated from you, nor to be forever alone in the world to come. Is there any man that has no more sense that would and will make a base story of such a fact? His name shall be published. What honest man or woman can find fault with such a doctrine as this? None. It is not a doctrine to be preached to the world, but to the saints who have obeyed the gospel and gathered to Zion. It is glad tidings of great joy. The Lord has given Joseph the power to seal on earth and in heaven those that are found worthy. Having the spirit of Elijah and Elias, he has power to seal with a seal that shall never be broken, and it shall be enforced in the morning of the resurrection. Talk about spiritual wives. One that is dead and gone is spiritual. We will come up in the morning of the resurrection, and every soul that is saved will have an eternal increase of glory. Will you believe this? Then the congregation give loud shouts of A. So, that's clearly establishing that eternal polygamy was doctrinal at that conference. But he's saying, don't teach this to the world, is what he's saying. And he says, and part of it, he does have a statement condemning earthly, he's warning against earthly practicing polygamy, but that is, in the context, he says, if anyone finds out, you will end up in a cell in Alton. You will go to, you will end up in prison if you, if they find out. And so there was this very real threat that if people discovered, if they could prove it beyond any doubt that these guys were practicing plural marriage, they undoubtedly would have been thrown in prison. In fact, Joseph Smith's brother, William Smith, he ironically, out of one side of his mouth, is condemning Brigham Young for teaching and the other apostles for teaching polygamy. Out of the other side, he is privately trying to practice polygamy himself, both in Nauvoo, then when he was briefly associated with James Strang, and then when he tried to start his own church after in 1848 or 1849, his church ends up breaking up because of him trying to teach plural marriage in secret while condemning it publicly. And then his wife actually divorces him and sues him for a divorce with the evidence she had of him teaching it. And then he actually served some time in jail for practicing plural marriage. So trying to do that among his, so it was a very real threat. And as Orson Hyde said, if they knew in Illinois that we had more than one wife when we were living there, they would have broken us up faster than they ever did. And the reality is, I think Kimberley mentioned this on your podcast with her. Joseph wasn't just representing himself. He was not just the saints, but he was the mayor of the largest city in Illinois at that time. That, Nauvoo was just, the saints gathered in Nauvoo were just as large of a population, if not large. It was actually larger than Chicago, if I'm not mistaken. And so that would have brought havoc on the church if it was publicized. And they probably would have never gotten the temple completed if Joseph had tried to do plural marriage publicly. They would have gotten kicked out of Nauvoo faster than you could blink an eye.
Yeah.
So
it's one of the things that the critics will point to is that we don't hear about plural marriage or Adam God doctrine or name your other doctrine that Brigham talked about when he was out west. Well, there's a real good reason why, right? People were ready to kill Joseph Smith for simply revealing new scripture. Now, can you imagine how bloodthirsty those same people would have been if, by the way, we're telling you what the true nature of God is here with Adam God, and to top it all off, we're going to upset your Victorian standards with this idea of plural marriage? They would have hung him so quickly, right? So it's no wonder that it's not until Brigham is outside the United States in a mountainous fortress of the Rockies where he feels like he's empowered enough and safe enough where he can let this out publicly. So when people say, well, we just don't hear it as much back then, and I'm like, well, no kidding. look at the circumstances in which Joseph is living. You got to be careful who you pass that along to.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is sources dating back to 1842 say that was part of the reason Joseph Smith was wanting to do those colonizing missions, where he was saying we need to eventually have some gathering places in the Rocky Mountains and out west. And they're saying people were connecting that part of the reason was for this was so that plural marriage could be lived in a situation without the persecution that would come upon trying to live it among Gentiles in the United States. And Lucy Walker recalled Joseph saying that I can't live with you openly as a wife now, but when the time comes in the Rocky Mountains, then I can openly acknowledge you as my wife. And so the secrecy was only intended to be temporary, and that's also why I believe they didn't have any children in Nauvoo, not until they knew that they were going to be driven from Nauvoo. Once they knew that, their time there was very limited, that is when I think they started to say, okay, we can, we don't have to worry about keeping this secret any longer, is
Right.
when Brigham said some of the apostles will deny this, publicly in the Eastern places, but he says, I never deny it. I just acknowledge it. I say, God has given me my wives, and they will be, and God will honor them as my wives. So, regardless of what anyone else says. So Brigham Young had a very bold personality, and he was, absolutely the right person to, take all these doctrines that were controversial and that were, that Joseph knew would cause persecution and hardship on the saints, and Brigham weathered that storm and was willing to establish them come hell or high water. So
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's one thing that I would like to mention. There's a great paper by Christopher Blythe talking about plural marriage and other sects that broke off from Nauvoo Mormonism. Even Joseph III admitted that most of the different groups had at some period some form of plural marriage. So Alpheus Cutler briefly did plural marriage, but he abandoned it very quickly. Lyman White did, but Lyman White actually, according to Gideon Carter, because they started to get some persecution for it, Lyman White withdrew the principle, and basically because there were some internal conflicts over it and there was some external persecution, that Lyman White said it's a true and holy principle, just the world isn't ready for it. He said they still lived with their wives, but they just didn't teach it anymore. And so, that's why Brigham Young kind of said it's a good thing we came out to Utah. Lyman White made people think that Joseph would have wanted the whole church to go to Texas. If we would have gone to Texas, we would have already been driven from there by now. This is what Brigham Young said. So, there's so many sources. Do we want to just go?
I want to say one other thing, and that is when you look at the data and the history from a truly from a place of truly wanting to get to the truth, I think the evidence is just overwhelming that plural marriage started with Joseph Smith, right? They like to say things like, well, Joseph didn't receive a revelation that would become D&C 132. The problem with that is that you have Hiram reading that revelation, right? You
probably have over a dozen people who are credible witnesses admitting that it was read.
And it is such a profound doctrine of that time that, as you were just stating, damn near every offshoot from the Brighamite Church is practicing plural marriage at one point or another. We know that Strang did. We know that White's group did. Certainly Brigham did. That's not a secret. As you were saying,
William Smith.
Smith. I mean, if you just look at that, it's hard to make the case that no, this is something Brigham made up. Well, that doesn't hold water, because for a large portion of that teaching, Brigham, if I'm not mistaken, is either in England or the Eastern States Mission doing missionary work, while Joseph is revealing a lot of this. So,
yep.
So either Brigham's really good about getting back and forth in 17th century America from the East to the Midwest to lay these foundations, or maybe the narrative's correct that this came from Joseph Smith.
So the next thing I think that would be a good point to cover. Are you recording it?
Yeah, we're recording.
Okay, perfect. So the next thing that I think would be a good point to cover is to steelman or argue, to try to come up with the strongest arguments for the other side of the issue. Because I'd be a hypocrite if I'm criticizing them for not engaging the strongest points against their position and not do it myself. And so I am always looking for the strongest points. And so one of the points that they try to say regarding the women testifying to being sealed to Joseph is these were adoption sealings, not marriage sealings. It's the most common thing when they see the overwhelming evidence of sealings. And they say men and women were both sealed to Joseph Smith. But the reality with that is we don't have any evidence of any adoption sealings being performed in Joseph Smith's lifetime. I strongly believe the law of adoption started with Joseph Smith because we have testimony from many different brethren in Utah that Joseph Smith revealed the principle about the sealing principles. But the reality is, Brigham Young said the law of adoption could only be done in a temple. Everything else he was willing to do outside of a temple, but he said the law of adoption and ordinance work for the dead. He basically said like endowments and second anointings for the dead, where he draws line and say those must wait until we get another temple built. And so I believe that even though Joseph very likely taught adoption, and part of the reason I believe Joseph taught adoption is Lyman White was doing adoptions in Texas. So if Brigham Young has the law of adoption in Utah and Lyman White has it in Texas, that's compelling evidence that it came from Joseph. The reason that Joseph didn't do it is because he was waiting for the temple to be completed. And in fact, when you look at the Nauvoo Temple Revelation, D&C 124, it's very clear that the ordinances pertaining to the fullness of the priesthood were supposed to wait until a temple was completed. It says that multiple times throughout that revelation, and it took special revelation for Joseph to be authorized to say, give endowments outside of the temple, to give second anointings outside the temple. That he received special revelation to perform those ordinances because the Lord said, you're probably not going to live to see the temple completed, so I am authorizing you to give these by permission, even though they will have all ordinance work done outside of a temple will have to be ratified in a temple, is what was taught. So the adoption sealing theory is something that you might see. Another theory is that this is only intended for eternity only, is the big thing. That's a common theory. Personally, I think that Valette Kimball letter we read about Sarah Ali getting pregnant and was tickled pink about it, that seems to be pretty compelling evidence in and of itself that this was not meant to be eternity only. Even though that's Joseph III's concession was he would concede maybe women were sealed for an eternity state only was what he said. But another strong piece of evidence against the eternity only theory is Ebenezer Robinson, he was another RLDS church member. He gave his testimony both publicly and first, I think he first privately as an RLDS church member. He gave his testimony to several different people, but later publicly he came out and said Utah didn't start all this stuff. He later came out and did a magazine called The Return, which he's going over his experience in Nauvoo, explaining, I know that a lot of these secret things that Utah is doing, from the temple ordinances, the endowment ceremony, to the plural marriage, I know this all started with Joseph Smith. But anyhow, here's a letter he wrote to Joseph Smith III. He said, Hiram Smith taught me the doctrine and told me and my first wife that he heard the voice of the Lord give it the revelation on polygamy on spiritual urgings to his brother Joseph, your father, and that which he, Hiram, had heretofore opposed the doctrine, he was wrong and his brother Joseph was right all the time. Having a perfect personal knowledge of these facts, together with many others I have not stated, a denial of them sounds to me like a great lie. I am sorry it is so, but we cannot undo the past. Our Heavenly Father knows all things. Before him we stand. And Jesus tells us that all things are written by the Father, and that every secret thing shall be revealed, and that which is whispered in the ear shall be published on the housetops. And then later on, he said, so in a different letter, this is in a letter to Jason Briggs, he said, uh, so he's doing question and answers. Jason Briggs asked, how did Hyrum Smith teach you to practice polygamy and keep it hid in 1843? Answer, he instructed me to take a selection of some young woman, and he would seal her to me, and I should take her home, and if she should have offspring, give out word that she had a husband, an elder who had gone on a foreign mission. He said, and we were told there was a place a few miles out from Nauvoo where females were sent for the purpose of, if they were to hide polygamous births. So that shows that this wasn't an eternity only thing. If he's saying that Hiram's saying, don't worry, if she gets pregnant, if she gets pregnant, we will just say she has an elder on a mission. And then he also remembered that they were told there was a place away, a few miles away from 12 or 18 miles from Nauvoo, where polygamous births could be kept secret, to go for a time if it was a controversy. And so, and William Clayton similarly recalled, in his journal, he got his plural wife, she got pregnant. She was one of the first pregnancies in plural marriage. And he actually had both Joseph and Emma give him counsel regarding it. And Joseph said, don't worry, just brook it. And if people find out and make a fuss, then I will cut you off from the church, but then rebaptize you and set you ahead as good as ever. So
Wow.
That's a pretty, telling statement right there. That, as a fundamentalist, that shows that this doctrine, which was originally introduced in private and not yet given to the total church, yet it was a doctrine of the priesthood. And even if William Clayton was cut off from the church, his standing in the priesthood would have still just been as valid, as John Taylor and many other statements say, that you can't be cut off. No man can lose his priesthood except through transgression. So it doesn't matter if you're cut off from the church. It matters whether you are actually being immoral or not, right?
Right.
So that kind of addresses the first point, adoption sealings. And the other big thing I would say is no other group ever attempted to say that these were adoption sealings. Like, if that were the case, why didn't William Marks wouldn't have been opposed to it. You wouldn't have all these different people who were saying, yes, he taught it, and I'm sad that he taught it. If it was just adoption sealings, Emma or someone would have clarified that and said, hey, those Utah people are twisting something into being something that it wasn't. Yes, women were adopted spiritually, but it wasn't for any wife situation. She doesn't say that. She actually explicitly denies even that, the eternity only. She says, not as a real wife or even a spiritual wife. Nothing of the sort happened in her RLDS denial. So she didn't leave open this. It's unfortunate that she did make the denials she did under the influence of her son, Joseph III. So clearly the adoption sealings, not polygamy, doesn't hold a whole lot of water as an argument, but that is one that they try to mention. I think we already covered pretty good the lack of pregnancies from Joseph and Hiram. My strong impression with that is the church leaders were especially careful because they knew the eyes were on them, that they were not planning to have any children with their plural wives until they could get a colony out west, where they could without it causing a problem. The people who did have pregnancies in Nauvoo, so you say William Clayton, Joseph Kingsbury, their plural wives, maybe if Ebenezer Robinson would have accepted polygamy, maybe he might have, but he didn't accept polygamy. So these are just lay members who are being introduced to plural marriage. Lay members aren't going to have the eyes on them that say the eyes are all on Joseph and say, or Brigham Young, So I think leaders were very deliberate to avoid having it cause problems for the church at large, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. I mean, a normal, I don't want to say run of the mill, but a lay member is going to have a lot less eyes on him than, say, Joseph or Hiram or Brigham or any of the other, major leaders of that time.
Yeah. So the next thing I want to cover is the allegation of polygamy actually started in England, or it was revealed in England, because that's a very common one that is gotten a lot more popular. There's been a lot more water been put or weight be put to this argument, because Brigham Young several times made comments about this. He said, while we were in England, the Lord made manifest to me by visions in his spirit things that I did not then understand. I never opened my mouth to any person concerning them until I returned to Nauvoo. Joseph had never mentioned this. There had never been a thought of it in the church that I knew anything about at that time. But this I had for myself, and I kept it to myself. When I returned home, Joseph revealed these things to him. I then understood the reflections that were upon my mind while in England. But then he goes on and he tells Joseph, and he looks around and looks me in the eyes and says, Brother Brigham, are you in earnest? Are you speaking what you understand? Are you in earnest? Says, I speak just as the Spirit manifests to me. Says he, God bless you. The Lord has opened your mind. And he turned and went off. So he said that was his first conversation on it was with Joseph. And so some try to say that, isn't that weird that, say, Brigham Young would get a revelation before Joseph taught him? Doesn't that sound like a odd story? So the reality is everyone in the church is able to get revelations. It's not just, it never was taught in early Mormonism that just the prophet is the only one that's get revelation. He's the only one that's to reveal new doctrine for the church, but all the members are, you in order to be a faithful member, you need to be getting revelations for yourself to guide you from the Holy Ghost. And so Brigham Young actually tells a story that's kind of funny. He says he got a revelation before so on Zion's camp, when they're marching to Missouri planning to reclaim Zion, right? He says he got a revelation 2 or 3 days before Joseph that they weren't going to actually fight, that the Lord had accepted their labors. And he tells a couple people that he got this revelation. And then finally Joseph tells the whole camp that the Lord wasn't going to require them to fight, and that the Lord had accepted their labors. And Brigham said he was actually ashamed that even though he got a revelation, that he would name it before Joseph had named it. And he said, I learned my lesson that time, that, if the Lord reveals things to you, you need to keep them to yourself unless the Lord commands you otherwise. There's this confidentiality, and that's something Joseph really emphasized too. If you remember in Nauvoo, where he said that, the Lord will not reveal his secrets to us unless we are capable of keeping his secrets.
Yep.
So
I think this also points out just why Brigham Young was the one to whom the mantle fell, right? Because on several occasions, as you so eloquently pointed out, Brigham is receiving the same kind of revelations Joseph is, right? And Joseph is simply backing up what Brigham has felt, though Brigham has kept it to himself for the most part, right? And so I think this is also a testimony builder of just how in sync Brigham was with the Spirit and with the Lord, because he was capable of receiving the same things Joseph was.
Yep. So Brigham Young, this isn't well known, but Brigham Young actually had the doctrine of exaltation revealed to him in England. A lot of people remember Lorenzo Snow saying that in England he got it revealed, as man as God once was, as God as man may become. And Lorenzo Snow said it was actually partially revealed to him earlier by a patriarchal blessing by Joseph Smith Sr. in Kirtland, where he said, you will be as great as God is what, if you are faithful. And, that kind of opened his mind to it. But Brigham had the exact same revelation in England. He said, while on a mission to England, the following came forcibly to my mind. As God was, so we are now. And as he is now, so we shall be. Our father was born of parents, having a father and mother just the same as we have. And there's several other statements of him talking about that. But what's interesting is we know That might sound odd also, but we actually have documented proof that the doctrine of baptism for the dead actually originated in England among the English converts, in that a woman named Anne Booth had a vision in England about salvation for the dead, that the gospel was being preached to the spirit world. And in this vision, she was shown that the baptism was being offered to these spirits in the spirit world. And this circulated in England. And Joseph, it got back, sent by letter back to the United States. And Joseph gets her vision and says, yes, that's a correct vision. And she said there was something incorrect in that she was thinking that maybe baptism was offered, that they were performing baptisms in the spirit world. He says, but that was just a misunderstanding. That wasn't, the vision was impressing upon her mind the necessity of baptism. And so that's where the first inklings of baptism originated, was actually from England. And so Brigham Young also commented on baptism for the dead, saying, the doctrine of baptism for the dead, you've been taught for some time, and the first account that I heard of it while I was in England, it was there that I got the glad tidings that the living could go forth and be baptized for those that had fallen asleep. Obviously, they didn't practice it in England. It wasn't until they came back to the United States, and Joseph laid out the procedure to perform that ordinance. But there's precedents for a revelation in England on these different doctrines. And in my mind, this all makes sense because of a quote by John Taylor that I actually just recently read. He said, I remember on a certain occasion in Liverpool in England, we were told not to say anything about the doctrine of the gathering. A lady came to me and said she had a singular dream. I dreamed, she said, that the whole church was going off to America and that you were there and we were going to board a ship and leave for America. And he goes, what was the reason of her having this dream? She had embraced the gospel and it revealed certain things to her that she could not have known in any other way. Your old men shall dream dreams, etc. Can you keep people in the dark in relation to these things? No. And when a people live their religion and all the quorums of the church are walking up to their privileges, the certain ancient aphorism would be correct. The voice of the people is the voice of God, and the voice of the God is the voice of the people. It would suit either way. So it's interesting. They said that they weren't, for a brief time in England, they weren't talking about the doctrine of gathering, but members had a dream about it anyway, being a principle. So, and Brigham Young in the Council of 50, when they were discussing the issue of keeping things confidential in the Council of 50 in Nauvoo, and this is after Joseph's death, he says, the problem of the saints knowing what is going on in this council, quote, the whole church knows what we are doing. The Spirit dictates it to them, and you can't shut it out from them. So, the saints that are living their religion are going to get revelations from the Spirit, keeping them in the loop of what's going on and what they need to know for their salvation. And you have similar things with plural marriage, like Bishop Abraham Hunsaker said he heard whispers about plural marriage being taught in Nauvoo, and it troubled him until he prayed to the Lord earnestly to, get a vision for himself. And that's when he had a glorious angel, or actually a God, appear to him. It might have even been Christ, he doesn't specify, and tell him that, you will not inherit the glory I have unless you have, the counselors that I have. And he appeared with his wives alongside him. So, that's that, to me, the argument in England, that people were getting revelations on it in England doesn't bother me at all, because that just shows that the saints were living up to their privileges and getting revelations from the Lord.
Yeah.
So
sorry.
Nope, you go ahead.
I was going to say, it's interesting because we see this even sometimes with inventions or technology, right? Oftentimes, men will have the same idea about the same thing simultaneously, and it's not till they all, and it's not until they all come together that they come with their various parts and pieces to put it all together. So this isn't unusual, and I've said this before about Mormonism. If we're not having an encounter with the divine, whether that is a manifestation of the Spirit, whether that is miraculous blessings, whatever the case is, if we're not having those, I don't think we're doing Mormonism quite right.
Yep.
Right. I think that's one of the things that's promised to us. And it's definitely a sense that you get from Joseph a lot of times is, I had my experience with God and you can too. This is what we got to do. Right. And so, yeah, if we're not having those, I don't think we're doing Mormonism quite right. I'm not saying it's going to be that kind of spiritual high all the time, but we should certainly be living in such a way that we can expect those kind of blessings.
Yep. So there's statements that indicate RLDS leaders privately knew. We talked about some of the members telling leaders, but there's other statements by like Joseph III privately acknowledging that he knew that plural marriage started with his father. In a letter to William Smith, he wrote this, and now check this quote out. I have long been engaged in removing from father's memory and from the early church the stigma and blame thrown upon them because of polygamy. And I have at last lived to see the cloud rapidly lifting. And I would not consent to see a blame attached by a blunder now. Therefore, my uncle, bear in mind, are standing today before the world as defenders of Mormonism free from polygamy, and go ahead with your personal recollections of Joseph and Hiram. So he's saying, I've worked really hard to get rid of the stain of polygamy from off of my father's name, and I will not consent to a blunder now, Uncle William. So he privately acknowledged it. And there are other, Jason Briggs, who's another RLDS leader. He got to hear John D. Lee's kind of confessions when either he heard them in person or he got a copy after they'd been written, where John D. Lee is pissed off at Brigham, but he's still saying that I know that polygamy started with Joseph Smith. I learned about it in Joseph Smith's lifetime from Joseph Smith himself. And so Jason Briggs writes, Dear brothers, how do you like hearing the statement of Lee that Danites and polygamy are institutions of the first Joseph the martyr? In view of the accumulating evidence of human infirmity attaching to the choice seer as well as all other seers, is it not folly to attempt to reinstate the defunct notion of infallibility of prophets, etc.? So, he's acknowledging, I think that there's some pretty compelling evidence. And similarly, David Whitmer, who again didn't join the RLDS Church, he was actually his own independent. He just stuck as an independent kind of witness and of the Book of Mormon, and was kind of skeptical and antagonistic to the later teachings of Joseph Smith beyond the Book of Mormon. But he wrote this in 1887. I now have as much evidence to believe that Brother Joseph received the revelation on polygamy and gave it to the church as I have to believe that such a man as George Washington ever lived. I never saw George Washington, but from reliable testimony, I believe that he did live. So he says, I am as certain as that Joseph Smith did polygamy as George Washington lived. And he says, if you accept the Doctrine and Covenants, the Doctrine and Covenants says that you are need to receive the word of God through Joseph Smith. And so he says, if you accept the Doctrine and Covenants, you have to accept the plural marriage revelation that he received, is what and so David Whitmer is against the Doctrine and Covenants by that time, but he makes a good point that, pointing out the verse in the D&C about how the word of God is going to come to the church through Joseph on further matters of doctrine. So, it's just overwhelming. So the last issue that we need to touch on is the denials. We'll probably touch a little bit on the history and getting into the denials, but Joseph and Hiram made some very strong denials to plural marriage, while telling people not to practice it. And so Hiram, for example, said, I wish the elders of Israel to understand that it is lawful for a man to marry a wife, it is unlawful to have more, and God has not commanded anyone to have more. And if any of you dare to presume to do such a thing, it will spoil your fun, for you will never preach the gospel. This is the same sermon where he announces eternal marriage and eternal polygamy. So I consider this the polygamy deniers' dilemma, because they really like this part of the sermon. They don't like the eternal marriage and eternal polygamy part. But as a historian, I have to accept the whole sermon and I have to account for the whole sermon. So he says, I despise a man who will teach a pack of stuff that will disgrace himself so. For a man to go into the world and talk of the spiritual wife system, a man is as empty as an open sepulcher. If the coat suits anyone, let him put it let him put it into. I would call the devil my brother before such a man. I believe if a man has one wife in this life, and I know if I had two, I should not know what to do. That they might quarrel about me, and I might get a whipping. One is enough. And I warn all of you not to attempt it. If a man should begin to find out, you would end up in some cell in Alton. Get the wife that God and your country let you have. If any brother hears any person preach such stuff, wring his nose. Look out, or he might be stouter than you. No man would have more than one wife, or they will beat him. And if I was a woman and got so fooled, I would hide his head. I give the sisters leave to wring his nose who teaches such stuff. So that, they say, that's not a carefully worded denial. That is he's either being a blatant hypocrite or a complete liar, or he's telling the truth, is what their perspective on that quote is. My perspective on this quote is the need for proper authorization to enter into plural marriage, because they did not want to see it abused. And they were horrified at what John C. Bennett was doing with his whoredoms, where they were sleeping around with women, taking away virtue, married and unmarried women, a pack of debauchery. And that's unfortunately what plural marriage can be abused into. And that is why Brigham Young said, the abuse of that principle will send thousands to hell. That there are people who are going to turn around and absolutely abuse and misuse the principle of plural marriage. And so my opinion is the only person who was authorized in Joseph Smith's lifetime to introduce people to polygamy was people that Joseph authorized. It was only to be taught by Joseph's consent. And Joseph would occasionally authorize other people to teach it as well. Like we have Benjamin F. Johnson says Joseph told him to teach it to his sister so that she could know it, and Joseph could propose to her, plural marriage to her. And obviously Brigham was somebody who was also one of the early dogs in plural marriage, and he was one of the few people that Joseph authorized to perform all the different temple ordinances. And so, there were certain people that Joseph did authorize, but generally to the elders in general, this was something that was not to be passed out lightly, and it was only to come through the legitimate channel of the priesthood. And there are two principles that touch upon this. One of them is in the endowment. There's the covenant of chastity revealed in the endowment, which Brigham Young publicly said in one of the Journal of Discourses sermons. So I'm not afraid to quote it. I will not, that you are not to touch a daughter of Adam unless given to you by the Lord. And that covenant goes back to Joseph Smith, and John C. Bennett in his expose of the Holy Order mentions that covenant almost word for word, and says that Joseph was regulating the marital practices of those who entered into his society. So everyone who got endowed made that covenant, and receiving it from the Lord was understood in Joseph Smith's lifetime was that you needed to receive it from the Lord through Joseph Smith as the authorized agent to introduce to keep this principle from being misused and abused. And so in every order of priesthood, there was a government that Joseph established. In the Aaronic priesthood, there was a presiding bishop who presides over the Aaronic priesthood. In the Melchizedek priesthood in the church, there was the presiding high priest, who stands as the president of the priesthood, president of the church. And in the fullness of the priesthood that Joseph Smith began to introduce in Nauvoo of kings and priests, there was a presiding key holder that Joseph introduced, and Joseph was the person who presided in those keys. And so Joseph conferred the keys on others, but they were to exercise them in union with Joseph Smith.
Right.
That was the channel of authorization was through Joseph Smith. And so it's in that context that you get the denials. Like the most famous one, they cite this as an example of a change to the history of the church. Thursday, October 5th, 1843, at home, walked up down the street with my scribe and gave instruction to try those who were preaching, teaching, or practicing is crossed out, the doctrine of the plurality of wives on this law. Joseph forbids it, and the practice thereof, no man shall have but one wife. And so that's statement that people really like to quote and say the apostles totally changed this in the history. And they try to say it's evidence of Joseph's journal being altered, but they did not alter the original entry in Joseph's journal. We still have the original entry. They edited it and expanded it for publication so that people would understand the principles behind Joseph Smith saying what he did on that occasion. So in the history, they expanded it to say, evening at home and walked up and down the street with my scribe, gave instruction to try those persons who were preaching, teaching, or practicing the doctrine of the plurality of wives. For according to the law, I hold the keys of this power in the last days, for there's never but one on the earth at a time on whom this power and its keys are conferred. And I have constantly said that a man shall have but one wife at a time, unless the Lord directs otherwise. And this entry of the history was written in, I think, about 1857 by George A. Smith and Wilford Woodruff. And that was just harmonizing that entry and explaining it according to what they had personally been taught about plural marriage by Joseph Smith. George A. Smith recalled that Joseph Smith quoted Jacob 2:30 and said that God has commanded us. So, it wasn't Brigham Young who reinterpreted Jacob 2:30 or came up with the polygamy interpretation of it. Joseph Smith was the one who did it. And, even William Law said that as an unbiased witness who didn't like polygamy, admitted, I remember there was this verse in the Book of Mormon that seemed to authorize it if God told you to do it, is what William Law recalled. So he says, even in the Book of Mormon, Joseph was conspiring to later do polygamy 13 years later. It's kind of what William Law said. And so in Nauvoo and under Brigham Young also, there was the strict need to have it received through proper authority. And this understanding that, that Joseph Smith was the presiding key holder, the presiding king and priest, or what we would call it. They call it the prophet, priest, and king was the office that Joseph held and what later Brigham Young and John Taylor held. And so they acted in that capacity to basically regulate and to try to prevent abuses of plural marriage. And unfortunately, right after Joseph died, William Smith and George J. Adams were abusing plural marriage in the East. They were doing the exact same stuff John C. Bennett was doing, where they were sleeping around, marriage or no marriage, under the guise of, it was a mess. And Brigham Young initially told William Smith to stay back east because we don't want you to get killed like your brothers were. That just shows the Carthage conspiracy nonsense to be nonsense, because otherwise Brigham would be like, come back here, so that we can murder you. But no, he said stay back east so that you can be safe, but when they found out what William Smith and George J. Adams were doing, they called them back to Nauvoo to try to keep them under control. And Brigham Young, basically told George J. Adams, you got to repent, and, we'll forgive you if you make a public confession that you were embezzling money and committing being unchaste in the East. And George J. Adams like, okay, I agree. And Brigham Young's like, a confession never did a man any harm if he was sincere about it. There's a confession never did somebody any harm if he was sincere about it. But instead of confessing, George J. Adams ran out of town and basically started attacking Brigham Young, started slandering Brigham Young. And he actually goes back to Boston, and he actually accuses Brigham Young of adultery in Nauvoo because he knew Brigham Young was doing polygamy. And so what a freaking hypocrite to attack. Brigham Young's willing to show you mercy and forgiveness if you'll repent, and you go and try to get him in trouble with the law by accusing him of adultery. So and William Smith, they tried to be careful with him, but he ended up throwing out with Brigham Young. He tried to take over the church and got he got, they ended up having a schism. And the apostles, frankly, were glad to have William Smith out of the way, because William Smith was a scoundrel. He was not a man of integrity. He got, how many people got in fist fights with Joseph, where he got to the point where he almost killed Joseph in the Kirtland Temple. And he was actually even involved with John C. Bennett's whoredoms, and Joseph tried to cover for his brother and tried to get him to repent, but he apparently just kept doing it even after Joseph showed him mercy, and Brigham Young also showed him mercy. So William Smith was a scoundrel, and Parley P. Pratt kind of commented that I could not. He's like, you might have William Smith back in Nauvoo, and you might be, people might be trying to make amends, but after learning all the details of what he has done out here in the Eastern churches, I cannot sustain him as an apostle anymore after what he has done to insult and destroy families with the conduct that he had been doing. And so, the apostles were kind of glad to be done with William, because he unfortunately, even though he was the prophet's brother, was not a man of integrity. And so what's interesting is some of these statements basically saying that there's one person who presides over the priesthood of Elijah come out in response to William Smith and George J. Adams' immorality, where you have Parley P. Pratt and Orson Pratt both writing statements where, teaching this doctrine, and Orson Pratt saying, all sealing covenants and promises which may have been entered into in any of the saints in the East in relation to eternal union, independent of the sanction and approbation of him who holds the keys of the sealing powers conferred by Elijah, are null and void, being made in unrighteousness and in direct opposition to the order of the kingdom of God. If a husband and wife wish to enjoy each other's society in the world to come, let all their covenants and promises be made at a proper time, in a proper place, and under the sanction and approbation of the one holding the legal authority and keys of this sacred thing. And that was published in the Times and Seasons, the August 1845 issue. So
Wow.
this was to protect the sacred principle of plural marriage, and that was the purpose of this. And they had to struggle with it on the trek west, where they were trying to keep it under wraps. And you see Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball making almost as strong statements as you see Joseph and Hiram in Nauvoo. Like Heber C. Kimball says, I would rather have my head severed from my head severed than to do what some of these elders have been doing. And he says, it is he says, it's a disgrace. It's been practiced. I would rather have my head brought to the block than do those things. And he talked about kind of the proper order that Joseph Smith introduced. He said, if I want a wife and Brother Pulsifer or I have a daughter, you cannot go and make overtures to her. You must first ask the one who holds the keys if I have a right to get a wife. And if he can get a wife, then he has no right still to go to the daughter, but to her father. And if he permits, then he can ask. And so that's another statement at winter quarters. And then Brigham Young, commenting on W.W. Phelps, made a mistake of marrying some wives without authorization from Brigham because he was traveling with them. And Brigham Young says, I am sorry, plenty sorry it is done, but you've been living in adultery with them. It is impossible for any man in the priesthood to have the second woman unless given to him by the consent of the man who holds the keys of the sealing power. Then he has the privilege of taking a woman if there is nothing in the way. Are you operating in the Gentile world to get more wives? No, it is by the celestial law you are to get wives. Well, now go get them according to the order of that law. If you are in your father's palace, he initially says to his children, you must not touch them. But when he's proven faithful, the father says, my son, here's a jewel, take her into your bosom. And when he sees him faithful and can govern that one, then he can give him another. He says, these girls are no more yours than mine. And he says, I have a right to sleep with them as much as you, and it would be just as right. I'd rather have my right arm cut off. Joseph never allowed the 12 nor any man to marry a girl on a mission. We brought girls home after a 2 years mission to England, but we never touched them. We paid their passage. Did we flirt with them or put our arms around them? No, we did not touch them. They married others, such as Samuel. Here's Woolley's wife. And he says, Sister Augusta Cobbs was given to me by revelation from Joseph, but I never did anything until long after the ceremony was performed proper and all made right. If Brother Phelps had told us he was going to bring a girl, I would have given her to him and glad to do it. but now it will be blazed all over the country, and you can't prevent the elders of Israel from running into whoredoms. And so basically, it was a misunderstanding by W.W. Phelps. And Brigham shows him mercy and rebaptizes him and reordains him and performs the sealings. But, he says the concern was about this getting out of control and being abused by people who don't know how to do it the right way or wouldn't do it the right way, is the context of it. And so another thing that I think is significant in early Utah is that Brigham Young, when men in early Utah were wanting to marry wives, there was a zeal almost in the Reformation for people to enter into polygamy. There was like this, everyone was wanting to get, to practice plural marriage. And one thing that Brigham Young did that isn't given enough credit, in my opinion, is that he used his control over the sealing power to try to avoid abuses in plural marriages of men trying to marry underage girls that would not be proper, that were not mature enough to get married. And so Brigham Young made a comment to one person saying, "You're now in relation to having a young woman sealed to you as received. I'm willing to seal a woman to you, but it strikes me that this one is rather young. Still, if you think not, and all is agreeable, bring her along, and I will. If I think it wisdom, I will seal her to you." So some of these marriages in early Utah were basically a caretaker situation where there were sealings for young women that were, young teenagers, but with the understanding that they wouldn't live as husband and wife until they're older and more mature, is something that did occur. But in this case, he's saying, I'm not sure if this woman, she seems rather young, right, give me more details. And if I think it's wisdom, then I might seal her to her. He didn't end up doing the sealing. And then another statement, Brigham Young said, he said, "I shall not seal people as has been done. Old Father Allred brought 3 young girls, 12 and 13 years old. I would not seal them to him. They would not be equally yoked together." So Brigham Young used his authority presiding over plural marriage to try to prevent people from abusing the principle and marrying, underage girls.
To try to prevent a Warren Jeffs kind of situation.
Yeah, exactly. So, a lot of people talk about how that one man doctrine can be abused, and it absolutely can. But there can be a benefit to having a government of the priesthood that regulates and protects from abuses. And so that's where the balance comes in my opinion, because Brigham Young taught that he was the presiding key holder, but he also said, don't ever blindly follow me. He says, right, you need to have your testimony for yourself from the Lord. And if everyone if you lean on me, you're not going to end up in the celestial kingdom. He says, you got to be independent and have the true independence of heaven for yourself.
I think you raise a good point. And I think it's something that quite frankly, is, like you said, there has to be a balance struck, right? Where someone's not telling you how to live, not Gestapo tactics, right? But at the same time, and if I was to be somewhat critical of fundamentalism at this point, it's that I think we need some sort of way of being able to have somebody check our crap once in a while, right? To say, I think you're off base here. Not just plural marriage, but maybe even just religious ideas, somewhere where you can go and talk to someone and be like, I think you're off in the weeds here, brother, and let me explain to you why, and let's reason this out. And that's one of those things that there does have to be a happy medium there in order not only to protect people, but principles as well.
Yep. Amen. It's, the gospel, it is to sanctify us individually and there is individual benefit, but there is supposed to be that community structure, that so much of the New Testament talks about the church, and references the people united rather than as single individuals. And so that, while a person, I think people can be called in the church. I think people can be guided by the Lord in an independent situation. But I do think the ideal situation is having that community and having that structure so that you aren't, making, say, God in your own image, where your blind spots can be possibly checked by a faithful brother who has good intentions.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Well, dude, this was epic.
so yeah, so I do think we do need to cover one thing.
Okay.
One last thing that I think is important is we need to discuss, even though the sealing power was regulated under Joseph and Brigham, most fundamentalists don't seem to, I think if you talk to most fundamentalists, they will acknowledge that they think that there's authority in more than one place today. And that they will recognize, they will recognize that there may be valid priesthood outside of just, say, the people they're associated with, and or even sealing authority held in different places, or even, authority to do plural marriage outside of what, say, their particular belief about authority is. And so one thing that shows that, that God and his priesthood will adapt according to circumstances. There's always eternal principles, but there's also the in practice, the circumstances can affect how different principles are implemented. Under John Taylor, um, things seem to change, where he actually was not as actively involved with plural marriage regulation as Joseph and Brigham were. And part of the reason for that is because of the federal persecution on the church. The 1882 Edmunds Act basically led to John Taylor, as the president of the church, saying, I cannot have personal knowledge or involvement with polygamy as a principle, in practice, because of my standing in the church. And they were trying to find out information about plural marriage and throw all the practicing polygamists in prison. And so basically at that time, John Taylor uninvolved himself as the key holder of being involved with plural marriage. And he actually authorized dozens, if not hundreds, of men to perform plural marriages as they were led to by, he said that recommends could be signed by any number of different church leaders, but that, that he was not personally involved with it. And this comes up when he was called to be on trial and to testify in a case of plural marriage in October of 1884. He was kind of subpoenaed, as I understand, and basically asked, let's see. Yeah. So he was subpoenaed and asked to, basically what he knew about plural marriages being solemnized and where the records were. And he basically said that he wasn't involved. And he basically says, I give the authority, but there's other people that also hold authority. And he says, have you conferred upon any person that authority within the past 3 years? He goes, yes. Why? Who else? He says, sometimes Joseph F. Smith, sometimes George Buchanan. Do you remember any others who you conferred that authority within that time? Oh, I do not remember anything that at present. When this authority is conferred upon you by anyone or you, is an authority limited to some case, or is it general authority? It would be general in all cases until rescinded. I understand it is from you the authority comes. Yes, sir, but I have nothing to do with the details of the matter. But you are the sir who confers the authority? Yes, sir. And he says, then do you know upon whom you've conferred that authority? He goes, there are hundreds of people who have the authority. And he says, who in this city is authorized to celebrate plural marriages? He says, a great many have been appointed, hundreds. Could you give me names of those in the city who are now authorized to perform plural marriages? I could not. Do you mean there are so many? He says, there's a great many that would be authorized under certain circumstances. And this leads to the great sermon in the Journal of Discourses, where he talks about temples are made for man, not man for the temples. I might be getting that wrong, but he basically says that, well, temples are a great place to perform ordinances. If we are opposed by the world and made it so that we can't do our ordinances in temple, the work of God's going to continue, and we're going to continue doing ordinances anyway, because it's the authority that's the most important thing, not the place, if that makes sense. And he basically said that they tried to interrogate him to try to figure out where they could find records of plural marriages. And he says, it was wisdom that I wasn't knowledgeable about this, so that they couldn't use it to persecute people who are keeping alive this principle. And so that basically continued under Wilford Woodruff. Even after the manifesto, he's saying, he basically appointed George Buchanan to keep plural marriage alive without Wilford Woodruff really being involved with it. There are, and Lorenzo Snow even commented when he heard somebody told him about George Buchanan authorizing a plural marriage. Lorenzo Snow reportedly quoted, said, I will not interfere with President Woodruff's unfinished business, is what Lorenzo Snow said about George
Wow.
Buchanan doing plural marriages. And so this could easily be where, tie into the 1888 story, where you have
Right.
you have men who say that John Taylor commissioned them to see to it that plural marriage is perpetuated no matter what, right? And so,
And what's so let me paraphrase what you just said there so I make sure I understand. Let's take the temple issue first. Optimally, you would want a temple to do that in. But if that's not available, the ordinances can still be had.
yep.
Now, what you said about John Taylor and plausible deniability, I think we can actually point to something that Joseph F. Smith had said. And this came out of, I can't remember what book it was, but it was by Quinn, where there were numerous people who came to Joseph F. Smith and said, hey, we want to be sealed. It's me and this other lady. Can we still do that? Meaning plural marriage. And back to what you said about Taylor authorizing other people to do that. Joseph F. Smith's response was always, if you can find someone to do that for you, God bless you.
Yeah.
And so you can see that, and look, we know that even within regulated groups and churches, that authority does get passed around to even people in that other people other than just the key holder in that group. So this idea that he's passing around that authority, yeah, it's spot on, right?
Absolutely. And then I think a key thing is the 1886 revelation kind of confirms it, where he's saying that men are now having free agency regarding these matters, because of, times are perilous, but, people who still want to keep the laws can still do so if they're directed to. So
Yep.
one other point that I'd mention, you've talked before about how when you first lived plural marriage, it was by a solemn covenant, which is something Ogden Kraut's written on. One thing that I think is very fascinating is that we have a statement recorded in the Abraham Cannon diaries, recording 3 different members of the first presidency, Wilford Woodruff, Lorenzo Snow, and George Buchanan. So Lorenzo Snow was actually president of the Quorum of the 12, but he'd be the next prophet of the church. So you have Woodruff, George Buchanan, and Lorenzo Snow all agreeing that men who are in a situation where they couldn't get sealing authority, but were impressed by the Lord upon righteous principles to live plural marriage, that they would be justified. So this is a fascinating journal entry, and it's on April 5th, 1894. Father George Buchanan now spoke of the unfortunate condition of the people at present in regards to marriage. A man in Pima, Arizona married the widow of a deceased brother. He did not realize till after the manifesto was passed of his true condition. Now he's raising up seed to his dear friend, while he himself is likely to be left without posterity. Then there are men whose wives are barren and are likely to be left without representatives on the earth. Young widows are left with some alternative of marrying Gentiles or remaining single all their lives. It seems that something will have to be done sooner or later to remedy these conditions. My son David died without seed, and his brothers can't do a work for them in rearing children to bear his name because of the manifesto. I believe in concubinage, or some plan where men and women can live together under sacred ordinances and vows until they can be married, i.e., sealed. Thus, our surplus girls can be cared for, and the law of God to multiply and replenish the earth be fulfilled. There is a danger of wicked men taking offense at such a condition, and of good people taking offense thereat. And such a condition would have to be kept secret until the laws of our government could be changed so that to permit the holy order of wedlock which God has revealed, i.e., polygamy, which will undoubtedly occur at no distant day in order to correct the social evil. I do not say that this plan is the right one, but I appeal to the Lord to reveal what would be right in the matter to avert threatened evils. So then Lorenzo Snow comments, I have no doubt that concubinage will yet be practiced in this church, but I had not thought of it in this condition. When the nations are troubled, good women will come here for safety and blessings, and men will accept them as concubines. Then President Woodruff said, if men enter into some practice of this character to raise up a righteous posterity, they will be justified in it. The day is near where there will be no difficulty in the way of good men securing noble wives. There are terrible afflictions at the door of this nation, which will take their minds away from this people. And then in other discussions, they admit that the manifesto did not repeal the law of plural marriage. It just took the responsibility off of church members. Wilford Woodruff said it was advice, but that it did not change the law, for that law is eternal. So there you have it. 3 different members of the first presidency, George Buchanan, Lorenzo Snow, and Wilford Woodruff, all agreed that individuals could enter into a practice of that character to raise up a righteous posterity and be justified in that. The best church apologists can't refute that statement of 3 different church leaders, Lorenzo Snow, Wilford Woodruff, and George Buchanan. When this quote was pointed out to Brian Hales one time, Brian Hales was just kind of had to, use something about concubines, that's a royal flush. Or, he says, he basically just kind of wanted to mock it instead of acknowledging what the church leaders actually said after the manifesto. And so that's one thing. And then another quote that I think is significant and interesting is the statement about John W. Taylor on February 22nd, 1911, which is recorded in the Charles Penrose diary. He produced a copy of a revelation to his father, John Taylor, i.e. the 1886 revelation. He interpreted it to mean that the man who stood at the head was relieved of the responsibility of holding the keys, i.e. of plural marriage, and free agency was given to all my people. So John W. Taylor, John Taylor's son, went into his member. So he was unfortunately thrown under the bus after the second manifesto for perpetuating plural marriage. But he went into his trial basically saying, I understand this 1886 revelation as saying that this principle is still binding no matter what, but people have their free agency whether they're going to live up to it or not to receive the full blessings. And that's they didn't really like him saying that. He was a bit blunt, but when he was cut off, there was there was some apostles who were like, man, we cut off the guy who got more visions than the rest of the quorum combined. They knew that
Yep.
John Taylor's son, John W. Taylor, was a righteous man, and he was, what's interesting though is that, like you talked about Joseph F. Smith, there's several. He based the thing they didn't want to even consider is that the trial he mentioned that he felt they're like, would you act out of harmony with the president of the church? He says, I don't think I'm acting out of harmony with the president of the church. Are you implying that President Joseph F. Smith is okay with plural marriage? He says, you can take it however you want to take it, but I'm not going to say anything one way or the other. And they're saying, we aren't going to even consider the possibility that he would be okay, that he would not be going with, that he would not be sustaining the manifesto is kind of what they said.
Right.
But as Quinn showed, and as other sources show, that Joseph F. Smith, was giving a wink and a nod, telling he knew plural marriage was an eternal law. And he was giving a wink and a nod to men to continue to perpetuate it. And in the case of John W. Taylor, he actually brought him temple clothes. so that he could be buried in temple clothes, even though he was excommunicated for post-second manifesto plural marriage. So that shows that he still believed that John W. Taylor held priesthood, even though he was not a member of the church at that point because of plural marriage.
You know, oh,
Similarly,
sorry, go ahead.
sorry,
No, I thought you were done. Go ahead.
in a very similar circumstance, John W. John Woolley's granddaughter, recalled that after a stake conference where Joseph F. Smith spoke, that afterwards that Joseph F. Smith came up to her grandfather, John Woolley, and told him that he was terribly sorry about the fact that he had been excommunicated for plural marriage. And he said, "It was out of my hands, but we can bring you back in privately if you'd have a mind to." And what she recalled is that John Woolley said, "You cut me off publicly, I would have to be reinstated publicly in order to accept that." And Joseph F. Smith, I think, said that we unfortunately can't do that based off of where the church is at. So there's all these hints that Joseph F. Smith was really supportive of the proto-fundamentalist beginnings to keep the principle alive.
I find this time period within the church absolutely fascinating. That post-manifesto, even post-second manifesto time period where the thought of having another church or another group you went to wasn't really in vogue or around at the time. And so you have these winks and nods at people, right? And this is where fundamentalism begins to pick up speed. It begins to, and unfortunately, I think it's the beginning of the schism, right? Because as I read the history of this time period, you get this idea that, yeah, we excommunicated brother so-and-so for living plural marriage, but he's still a good guy and he's just fulfilling the laws of God, but we just can't acknowledge it. And then it seems like when Grant comes around, the hard schism is underway and won't be that camaraderie that those proto-fundamentalists and the church enjoyed, that brotherly love is now gone by the time you get to Grant. So
And unfortunately, a lot of the early fundamentalists didn't have, so like Lauren Woolley would talk about how, hey, church leaders were doing polygamy after the manifesto, even after the second manifesto. There were still apostles involved with this, but they couldn't prove it. It's only in the last several decades that we have access to all the journals and other records that show that the manifesto was not meant to end plural marriage, but was a lie to the government. And It's only now that we can look back and prove that the early fundamentalists were telling the truth about that. So it's very unfortunate that they didn't have access to the sources back in the 1920s and 1930s that we have today.
Yeah.
But I think the bright side of the sources that are available today, one bright side is that there's mainstream LDS people who see the end of plural marriage being a really messy issue. And even I think the church's own Gospel Topics essay admits that leaders kept doing, that it was a long process for plural marriage to be ended. So there's some sympathy for fundamentalism and saying that, yeah, they do seem to be justified according to this certain perspective on trying to keep alive the old ways of Mormonism. Yeah. And so there are some members of the church that are respectful of fundamentalists, even if they don't personally believe they're called to live plural marriage and don't believe, they're in the church. And I do think that church members, one thing that I think is fascinating, that I think church members should be appreciative of of fundamentalists, is that there were so many prophecies in early Utah that plural marriage would never be done away with.
Right.
That John W. Taylor saying that principle or John Taylor saying that principle will never be overcome. And at the Manti Temple dedication, Wilford Woodruff saying, plural marriage will continue until the coming of the Son of Man. And, there's so many statements along that nature that plural marriage would continue into the millennium, that wasn't going to be taken from the earth. And so even if you're a mainstream Latter-day Saint in the church, fundamentalists have fulfilled that prophecy of keeping plural marriage alive no matter what.
Yep.
So
Yep.
I do think that's a fascinating note.
Absolutely. Yeah. What you said before about there are members that are now coming around, and even though they may think we're wrong for living plural marriage, there are those that are coming around to at least being like, hey, I can respect you because you at least make your argument in history, and we may disagree, but that doesn't mean we have to be disagreeable.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
Absolutely.
that is hugely important right now, because in a lot of ways, a lot of the problems like we talked about here, the LDS church is just as vulnerable as any fundamentalist is with it, right? And so sometimes we do have to align on certain things just to protect our kids. So,
Mm-hmm.
well, dude.
Another thing.
Oh, sorry.
You go.
No, you go. Go ahead.
Well, and I do think that I'm when the polygamy denial movement kind of resurrected in the in the last decade or so, first kind of under Snuffer, and then there started to be other independent internet movements for this. The people who were at the forefront of it, from my perspective, were mostly fundamentalists. But now that these movements have just kept growing and becoming more antagonistic towards church members, I'm glad to see that more mainstream members are picking up the fight and realizing we need to know the history here in order to defend our heritage, and to defend the history that we know we have a testimony of, and we know that that these early brethren were prophets and were inspired in what they did, even if we might not be doing those things today. And so I'm glad to see, I hope that more mainstream Latter-day Saints can continue to get involved in understanding the history of plural marriage and the history of its introduction by Joseph Smith, in order to defend these false historical narratives that keep cropping up. Absolutely. That we're sick of.
Absolutely. All right, man. That was epic. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to talk about?
No, I think we just had a very epic, thorough conversation about plural marriage authority, its introduction, as well as the polygamy skeptic or polygamy denial movement. So that was good. I'm glad you had me on.
Dude, we always have these kind of epic conversations, so it's always great when you come on.
I personally, I'm getting pretty worn out with this issue, because I've been at it for several years, and it's often the same exact arguments over and over again.
I know.
As Kimberley told you. So, but I was willing. You invited me, and I was like, I've got to do this for Dave. So no, I
appreciate that. I tried to stay away from it because a fundamentalist talking about polygamy is pretty base, right? I mean, it's one of those things where it's like low hanging fruit. So I did my best to stay away from it, but man, you just keep having people coming harder and harder at it, and it's like, okay, enough's enough. I gotta deal with this. So,
well, I'm pretty worn out of it, and so honestly, what I've which sounds counterintuitive if I'm worn out of it, I actually recently started a new video YouTube channel, as well as a Facebook page entitled Debunking Polygamy Denial, where I'm planning to thoroughly address all of the different arguments and different, and bring up the different evidence of plural marriage, starting with Joseph, and just have a comprehensive place where these issues can be dealt with in almost I can deal with it and have it be done with, and I can just point back to that resource, and it can also be a resource for other people. And so
absolutely,
this is something that I've started, and if you want to throw a link in the show notes for any listeners who might be interested
Absolutely.
in further resources. Yeah, because I do think it's important to be armed with the knowledge, and I'm glad that you mentioned that you were armed with it recently when you had a family member come to you being like, I'm here about Joseph not teaching polygamy. So you were
Yep.
able to
Yep.
respond to that.
Yeah, no, look, this statement should get some hate. If you're an honest dealer, if you're really concerned with the truth, I think the evidence that that plural marriage started with Joseph Smith in terms of the restoration is pretty undeniable. You have to do some pretty significant mental gymnastics to get to the point where you think you can say it was all Brigham's idea or something like that. So, but anyway, dude, that was awesome. Let's do it again, only let's do it on a different topic. But yeah, let's get back together here sooner than later.
All right. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Bye, everybody.